Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. One Piece. Opening Valley of Gods, Dark Fruit. Chapter 31. The two fell to the ground, their eyes facing each other. Guinea's face became more and more rosy. It wasn't until Geoise patted her waist that she slowly straightened up. With a pop, their lips parted, but Guinea still didn't get off Geoise. She sat on Geoise with a pair of long legs in a figure-8 shape, and her posture looked even more ambiguous. She lowered her head and looked at Geoise below without blinking, and asked Shoutao. "Brother Geoise, just now, did you feel anything?" "Not bad, soft." "Oops." Guinea jumped up from Geoise in shame, covered her face and ran away. Geoise smashed his mouth, stood up and looked at Guinea, who had run away, and smiled softly. How could he not understand Guinea's meaning after being born in 2 generations, but he felt that now was not the time. At least we have to wait until he graduates from marine school. At that time, his physical age will only be 18 years old. In the following time, Guinea's attitude towards Geoise remained the same as before, but she often, accidentally, had physical contact with Geoise. Geoise responded calmly every time. Guinea, a young grass, was no match for an old cow like him. She was blushing with shame every time, and finally ran away. Of course, the two of them don't just play and fight, they spend most of their time training. Although Guinea's own talent cannot be compared with monsters like Geoise, don't forget her big eater attribute. She has never gained weight after eating so much. People with this attribute in the One Piece world are often not weak. Where to go? The daily intake of large amounts of food allowed Guinea's physical strength to grow very quickly. Coupled with the daily systematic exercise and professional guidance at marine school, after a few months, she had become the strongest among the female students. With a cheerful and generous personality, she often helps her little sisters deal with some flirtatious male students, and she has a faint tendency to become a big sister. But when facing Geoise, she still looks like a soft girl next door, and she is always molested by Geoise. On this day, Guinea ran a few laps around the training ground, then sat listlessly on the ground, drawing circles on the ground with her fingers. Several female students who played well with Guinea came over. One of them, a young female student with short blonde hair and a heroic spirit between her eyebrows, patted Guinea on the shoulder and asked with concern, "Guinea, why have you been so listless these days? It's not like you." Guinea blew the pink bangs on her forehead and said with a pout, "I'm fine, Jessica. When do you think Brother Geoise and the others will be back?" After hearing this, Jessica sighed helplessly, straightened her waist and said, "It's true, I miss your brother Geoise every day, and he's only been out for a few days and you're like this. You're a bit promising, my dear Guinea." Several other girls followed suit and teased, "Yes, Guinea, Geoise and the others have teacher Zephyr with them, so they won't run into any danger." "You are exaggerating. Speaking of which, Geoise is really outstanding. He was taken out on a mission by teacher Zephyr just a short time ago." "Who says otherwise? If it weren't for our Guinea, more than half of our girls would want to get close to him, even me." The girl stopped mid-sentence because Guinea had already pinched her face and asked with wide eyes, "What do you want to do?" "Nothing. I'm a staunch Guinea supporter." Jessica grabbed Guinea's ears from behind and said unhappily, "Okay, we won't compete with you for your Geoise brother, don't be like a hen protecting your cubs." Guinea turned around and hugged Jessica, saying with tears in her eyes, "Jessica, but I have never been apart from Geoise brother since I met him, I miss him so much." She rubbed her face on Jessica's belly, making Jessica feel numb all over. She held Guinea's pink little head and coaxed her softly like an older sister. On the male side, Flying Squirrel and the others were chatting while practicing. "I wonder how Sakazuki and the others are doing. I really want to go out to sea with them." "Hey, who wouldn't want to? The sea is not very safe now. Without the strength of the 4 of them, it's easy to lose your life even with the protection of teacher Zephyr." "Yeah, let's train hard." While everyone was chatting, a tall and beautiful figure suddenly appeared at the entrance of the training ground. She had a black high ponytail, light makeup on her face, a beauty mole next to the corner of her mouth, and her face looked very delicate. She wore a peach-colored short-sleeved top and dark shorts on her lower body. There was a prominent spider tattoo on her white and smooth thigh skin, and a luxurious sword was pinned to her waist. Such a beauty immediately attracted the attention of many male students as soon as she appeared. The female students were also looking at her. When they saw her towering breasts, many female students took a breath and lowered their heads in shame. Jessica pulled Ginny's collar and pointed at the girl standing at the entrance and said, "Ginny, look, that girl is very pretty, is she new?" Ginny just glanced and looked away. Her mind was full of hope for Geoise's return, and she had no interest in anything else. The girl's eyes swept around everyone in the training ground, and then she walked into the training ground with an elegant step. She walked up to the male students including Flying Squirrel, smiled sweetly, and fascinated Flying Squirrel and the others, then spoke softly, "Hello, is there a student named Geoise here?" When they heard that they were looking for Geoise, everyone's faces suddenly showed disappointment. Huo Shaoshan stood up and asked. Geoise and Sakazuki were taken out on a mission by teacher Zephyr. "May I ask who you are?" Hearing that Geoise was not there, the girl looked a little surprised. She stretched out her hand to half cover her seductive red lips and said, "My name is Guon." "You just said that Geoise went on a mission. Isn't he still a student?" "Yes, he is very strong. Teacher Zephyr thinks he has the ability to go out to sea to perform missions." "I see, no wonder sister he keeps mentioning him in front of me." Guon was pinching her chin and thinking about something, and a white and tender hand suddenly patted her shoulder. She turned her head and saw a pretty face that was the opposite of her style, but equally beautiful. Ginny looked at Guon in front of her with suspicion and asked, "Hello, my name is Ginny. I just heard that you were looking for brother Geoise. What do you want to see him for?" Guon tilted his head and said, "Of course I have my own business to find Geoise. Since he's not here, I'll leave first." With that said, Guon passed by Ginny and was about to leave without looking back. Ginny frowned slightly. She suddenly flashed in front of Guon and said, "Brother Geoise and I have known each other since childhood. If you have anything, you can tell me first. I will tell brother Geoise when he comes back." Guon was startled by Ginny's speed. When he heard about Ginny's relationship with Geoise, he immediately stopped and asked with interest, "Oh, it turns out we are childhood sweethearts. Why does my little sister look so nervous? Are you Geoise's girlfriend?" "Hey, what are you talking about? My relationship with brother Geoise is not what you think." Ginny stood there with a flushed face, her hands tugging at the corners of her clothes. Jessica, who was following her, slapped her forehead helplessly when she saw Ginny's appearance, secretly thinking that there was no hope. Guon smiled slightly. She stretched out a finger and touched Ginny's chest, feeling the elastic touch, and teased. "Then I was wrong. You just have unrequited love now, right?" Upon hearing this, Ginny suddenly felt like a little pink cat with fried fur, and shouted angrily, "You have unrequited love. Brother Geoise must also." "What?" Ginny didn't come up with a reason for a long time. She shook her head vigorously and said angrily, "It has nothing to do with you. Just say you have something to do with brother Geoise." Guon shrugged, placed his left hand on the handle of the knife at his waist, rubbed it gently, and said, "Of course I want to come and see the strength of the student who is said to be the strongest in this class. Sister, he has always been full of praise for him." Hearing that Guon was here to challenge, before Ginny could speak, Huo Shaoshan stood up again from behind and said, "Then Miss Guon, why don't you try 2 moves with me first? I think you also use a sword, right?" Flying Squirrel and others curled their lips, thinking that Huo Shaoshan was just taking advantage of Geoise's absence to show off in front of the beautiful lady. Speaking of which, Huo Shaoshan is really a sultry man. He usually looks smiling and honest, but in fact he is more excited than anyone else when he sees a beautiful woman. In the comics, he has a glorious record of being petrified by the Empress, which is a bit embarrassing compared to the Flying Squirrel who also faced the Empress before. Guon looked at Huo Shaoshan for a moment, nodded slightly, and said, "Well, it's indeed against the rules to challenge the strongest right from the start." As she spoke, she slowly pulled out the sword from her waist and made a swordsman's salute to Huo Shao Mountain, her expression extremely serious. Huo Shaoshan hurriedly returned the salute, and at the same time drew out his samurai sword. The Flying Squirrel beside him suddenly said, "Miss Guon, if I'm not mistaken, the one in your hand should be the famous sword Kinpira." As a pure swordsman, Flying Squirrel is familiar with most of the existing famous swords, and he remembers the appearance of the famous swords clearly. He often looks at the albums of famous swords late at night, and falls asleep. Guon also gave him a high look and said softly, "Yes, this Jinpailao was a birthday gift from Sister He to me. I like it very much." Sister Crane. I've been wanting to ask just now, does the Sister Crane mentioned by Ms. Guon refer to Vice Admiral Crane? Yes. Hiss. After receiving Guion's confirmation, everyone took a breath. Vice Admiral Suru's prestige in the headquarters can be said to be at its peak, and he is on the same echelon as Admiral Sengoku and others. With this background, Flying Squirrel and others who are still students are already worthy of the name of Marine Rich Family. Jessica leaned into Ginny's ear and whispered, "She turns out to be the sister of Vice Admiral He. It's a bit troublesome for Geoise to be entangled with such a person." Ginny acted very calmly from beginning to end. She just nodded and was very disapproving of Guion's so-called background. In her opinion, no matter how big the background is, what does it matter? Can it be bigger than her Geoise? Huo Shaoshan wiped the cold sweat from his head and couldn't help feeling a little regretful. This is Crane Vice Admiral's sister. If he hits her too hard later and hurts her. Although he Vice Admiral is a person who won't care about such things, I'm sure someone will take it out on Vice Admiral He's behalf. Guon seemed to have anticipated what everyone was thinking. She chuckled and said, "Don't worry, our competition is a normal competition and won't involve any messy things, not to mention." A sharp cold light flashed across Jinpira's sword, and Guion's entire aura changed. There was no trace of feminine weakness anymore, and his voice became colder. "I don't think I'm any weaker than a man. Aha." Guion's figure disappeared from the spot, and in the next second he appeared behind Huo Shaoshan, stabbing his lower back with a gold pira. Out of a man's instinct, Huo Shaoshan burst out with an astonishing reaction speed. He turned around suddenly and blocked Guion's attack with his vertical sword. The trembling sensation coming from the sword made Huo Shaoshan put away all his miscellaneous thoughts. He roared and used brute force to open Guon, and then the long sword in his hand vibrated at an extremely fast frequency. As soon as Guon landed on the ground, she saw blazing flames coming from the sword of Huo Shaoshan. She narrowed her eyes and whispered, "The flame is formed by high-speed friction with the air. It's a very strange move." Huo Shaoshan held the handle of the knife with both hands, jumped up, and slashed down towards Guon below. Faced with this powerful and heavy blow, Guon did not choose to take it head-on. Instead, he easily avoided it again with his dexterous movement, and used the opportunity to distance himself from Huo Shaoshan. When Huo Shaoshan was about to raise her sword to pursue again, Guon suddenly sheathed Kimpira, and she tilted her body slightly, making a gesture to draw the sword. Compared with Huo Shaoshan, who was moving widely, Guon seemed to be still. When the distance between her and Huo Shaoshan was getting closer and closer, she finally moved. Jinbaluo was pulled out of the scabbard by her again, drawing a beautiful arc in the air, and a pink sword energy bloomed from it, accurately hitting the katana on the burning mountain. After completing this action, Guon held a sword flower in his arm, turned around and walked towards the flying squirrel and others who were watching the battle, as if he had declared his victory. Huo Shaoshan was still gritting his teeth to resist the sword energy fired by Guon, but in the end he couldn't hold on for a few seconds. He was knocked away with the sword, and finally fell to the ground in a very embarrassed state. The flying squirrel looked at Guon walking towards this direction with a solemn expression, and murmured, "She actually fired her sword energy. Shouldn't we say that she is the sister of Vice Admiral Crane?" Facing the stunned gazes of everyone, Guon put one hand on his waist, a bright smile appeared on his face again, and said loudly, "If the level of marine school is like this, then maybe I don't have to wait for Geoise to come back." Guion's words were particularly harsh to everyone's ears. Flying Squirrel suddenly pulled out his katana and was about to challenge him, but Ginny was already standing in front of Guon one step ahead of him. She looked directly into Guion's eyes and said word by word, "You're a little carried away. Brother Geoise's strength is not something you can question." Guon laughed. She had been the sweet girl of heaven since she was a child. She had always despised Ginny's behavior of praising a man wholeheartedly. She said in a disdainful tone, "Whatever you say, after all, you are just a little girl who is carried away by emotions. Please wake up, little sister, your brother Geoise may not be as good as you think." Jessica on the side had a look of anger on her face. She had a straightforward personality and didn't care about her background. She rushed forward to find Guon to reason with. Ginny grabbed Jessica with great strength, and Jessica was pulled behind her almost without any resistance. Taking out the golden pistol Geoise gave her, Ginny said coldly. "Aren't you here for a challenge? I'll fight with you." "You." Guon crossed his arms, glanced at Ginny's slim figure, and said. "Are you better than that person just now? Don't you know it when we fight?" Guon thought of the speed that Ginny had shown unintentionally before and nodded. She pointed the gold pira in her hand at Ginny and said. "Come on, let me see your strength." Ginny said no more. She raised her leg and fired out a tempest kick. Guon sidestepped and looked at the cracks made by the tempest kick on the ground. She nodded slightly and said secretly. "The power is good, but the speed is not enough." When she looked at Ginny again, she found that Ginny's figure had disappeared from her sight. However, Guon was not panicked at all. She had long since awakened observation hockey, and with her sense of sight, she quickly sensed Ginny's position. There were 2 gunshots, and 2 bullets were fired from behind Guon. Without even looking, she swung her sword back with one hand and split the bullets in half. She turned around gracefully and said to Ginny, who was not far behind her. "Little sister, you are already very skilled at shaving. For this reason alone, I admit that you are much better than that person just now." Among the spectators, Huo Shaoshan's face was red and he felt extremely ashamed. Ginny didn't take these words to heart at all. She would not be complacent because of such cheap praise because she targeted Geoise. She bit her lip lightly and knelt on one leg, the gun in her hand still emitting white smoke, thinking that this woman was much more powerful than she had imagined. She wasn't very skilled in the tempest kick, and Guon was obviously good at speed, so it was expected that she would be dodged. So her tempest kick was just a cover from the beginning, and gun skills were what she was best at. After all, the speed of bullets was much faster than her tempest kick. Just now, she used her shaver to find the best shooting position, but Guon easily saw through it and lost 2 bullets in vain. You must know that the number of bullets she has is limited. Once they are exhausted, she can only use taijutsu to fight against the jinpira in Guon's hands. This is obviously very detrimental to her. Guon raised his chin, with a charming smile on his lips, and said. "Speaking of it, this kind of open area is really unfair to you who uses a gun. I won't give you a second chance like the one just now. Otherwise, just admit defeat. If you get injured later, but it doesn't look good." Ginny snorted coldly, stood up slowly, and said coldly. "You don't need to worry about it anymore. It's still up to you who will win." Guon stretched out, slightly showed off his proud curves, and said in a lazy voice. Okay, let's continue." As soon as she finished speaking, Ginny used Xiao again and approached Guon directly in a flash. Guon also didn't expect that Ginny, a gunner, didn't want to distance herself from her. Instead, he directly played close to her, a swordsman. He suddenly laughed and said. "What, you seem to be a little too impatient. Playing close combat with me is not a wise choice." As she said that, she turned the jinpila in her hand over and used the back of the knife to hit Ginny's abdomen hard. This blow was so powerful that if she hit it, Ginny would probably lose her ability to fight. However, Ginny made an action that shocked everyone present. She faced the drawn jinbaluo with one hand, grabbed it hard, and held the blade firmly in her hand. The result of this was that the sharp blade cut her white fingers, and blood dripped down the blade to the ground. Guon widened his eyes and said in shock. "You're crazy. Aren't you afraid of becoming a cripple?" If Ginny didn't control her strength just now, with the sharpness of the famous Kimbiro sword, it would be really easy to cut off a few fingers. Guon was so frightened that she broke out in a cold sweat. She didn't expect that a girl like Ginny who looked cute would be so cruel to her. Even though the hand holding the blade was dripping with blood, Ginny didn't even frown. There was even a smile on her face, and she said softly. "What is this injury compared to the pain I experienced before?" In Guon's dilated pupils, Ginny punched Guon in the stomach. The force was so strong that she flew backwards and fell heavily to the ground. Ginny shook the blood on her hand vigorously and said to herself. "You have to pay a price for calling me brother Geoise." Guon covered his stomach with one hand and supported the ground with jinpira with the other to stand up. He coughed violently for a few times and then quickly recovered. A trace of black slowly faded from her abdomen. Flying Squirrel and others who were watching the battle noticed this and their faces darkened. Huo Shaoshan said with an ugly expression. Oops, she actually awakened armament Haki. Guinea's attack just now was offset by Haki. Huo Shaoshan's mood was even more complicated at this time, because it meant that just now he, a grown man, didn't even show off his armed colors in Guon, which was like another slap in the face. Guon even glanced at him, and she patted the dust on her clothes, her expression becoming increasingly grim. She had awakened her armed color, but the intensity was average. Guinea's attack just now was not cancelled out like Huo Shaoshan said. At least she could still feel the strong pain coming from her abdomen. This punch also made Guon angry, and she once again assumed the posture of drawing the sword, obviously wanting to end the competition. Jinny had seen Guion's sword energy and knew that she could not avoid it, but she still raised her pistol without fear and pointed the gun at Guon. Buzz. In anger, Guon fired a pink sword energy that was far more powerful than before. Almost at the same time, Jinny pulled the trigger, and a dark bullet sprayed out from the muzzle of the gun. After firing this bullet, Jinny suddenly seemed to have lost all her strength, and her body went limp and fell to the ground. However, the bullet that was easily cut off by Kimpura before was locked in a stalemate with the sword energy wielded by Guon. Guon stared at the bullet that was spinning in the air and said in a deep voice. The bullets wrapped around Haki. I didn't expect you to awaken your weapon color. Glancing at Jinny who was slumped on the ground again, she shook her head and said. It seems that you just woke up not long ago. It's hard for you to use it at this time, but Haki with this level is not enough to block my attack. As soon as she finished speaking, the bullet fired by Jinny finally reached its limit. After a violent shaking, it exploded into pieces. Without the bullet's blockage, the sword energy whizzed towards Jinny again. Flying Squirrel and the others could no longer hold back and wanted to rush forward to help. Once she was hit by the sword energy, Jinny would definitely be severely injured. Then they would really have no shame to face Geoise. It was just that it would be difficult to catch up with them at their speed. Jinny raised her pistol tremblingly. Even if she could only shoot an ordinary bullet, she would never admit defeat. But it was too late. Before she could pull the trigger, Guion's sword energy flew in front of her. The dazzling sword light made her subconsciously close her eyes, and countless thoughts popped up in her mind. I still lost, it's a bit embarrassing. I obviously work hard at training, and Brother Geoise often praises me. If you give me a little more time, I will definitely not lose to this woman. If I get hit, it will hurt a lot, right? Woohoo, I'm actually very afraid of pain. Why don't you feel it yet? I am not dead, am I? Doesn't that mean I will never see Brother Geoise again? No. Jinny opened her eyes suddenly, and a tall figure appeared in her sight. The sunlight had been blocked, leaving Jinny with darkness, but she felt very warm, because her Geoise brother was dark. Incarnation. The visitor was Geoise who had just returned. A bright and charming smile bloomed on Guinea's slightly pale face, and she called out in a soft voice. Brother Geoise. Geoise was holding a one-handed grasping posture, with a metallic light shining on his dark hands. Hearing Guinea's call, he turned his head with a smile that was very familiar to Jinny. But when he saw Guinea's bloody hands and pale face, bursts of strong black energy emitted from the corners of his eyes. As soon as Jinny saw Geoise, she felt all the weakness in her body swept away. She jumped up and hugged Geoise's waist from behind, and said happily. Brother Geoise, you are finally back. I miss you so much. Geoise stroked her pink hair and said softly. I've only been out for less than a month. It looks like my Jinny is in a hurry. Didn't she call her? The phone bug is so ugly. I still like to see Brother Geoise with my own eyes. Okay, calm down first and tell me what's going on with the woman opposite. Jinny nodded obediently and briefly explained the matter to Geoise. She did not say anything bad about Guon because of her defeat, only that she came to challenge. Geoise listened quietly. When Jinny finished speaking, he softly said, I understand. Suddenly, he lowered his head and kissed Guinea's smooth forehead. Jinny suddenly froze in place as if petrified. Geoise smiled and pinched Guinea's soft pretty face. When he turned to face Guon, there was no trace of smile on his face anymore, and his eyes were full of darkness that was so rich that it was ultimate. Guon still kept swinging the sword, with a dull expression on his face. Her mind was still stuck on the scene just now. Just when her sword energy was about to hit Ginny, Geoise's figure appeared like a ghost, and then crushed the sword energy. At this moment, when she met Geoise's eyes, Guon instantly felt a chill rush through her body. She subconsciously held the knife with both hands and said solemnly, "You must be Geoise. Sister, he is right, you are really strong." Geoise didn't answer. He put his hands in his pockets and walked towards Guon step by step with slow steps. The keen-minded flying squirrel secretly thought something was wrong. Geoise's mood seemed very wrong. The woman named Guon was in danger. The flying squirrel is not swayed by the beauty. He is not worried about Guon, he is worried about Geoise. Guon has said that she is the sister of Vice Admiral Suru. Although I don't know if they are related to each other, the relationship is definitely very close. He has absolute unconditional trust in Geoise's strength. Because of this, he is afraid that Geoise will make a mistake later and give Guon too. If something like that really happens, no matter how generous he Vice Admiral is, he may not be able to be kind. Once Vice Admiral he gets angry, even Teacher Zephyr may find it difficult to protect Geoise. Speaking of which, why did Geoise come back alone? Mr. Zephyr, where have you been? Do you know that this is going to be a big mess? Seeing Geoise getting closer and closer to Guon, Flying Squirrel was worried. He glanced at Huo Shaoshan and the others who were already stunned, cursed his teammates inwardly, then turned around and ran towards the office building. He wanted to go make a phone call. At this time, no one on the field noticed the Flying Squirrel's sudden departure. Guon looked at Geoise approaching him and tentatively swung his sword energy again. Geoise just waved his hand and scattered the sword energy into the air like swatting flies, without affecting his speed at all. His speed was not fast, but it put great psychological pressure on Guon. She exerted force on her feet and retreated quickly. She didn't stop until she was 100 meters away. Before she could take a breath to calm down, when she looked up, Geoise was already standing in front of her. Geoise leaned forward slightly and looked quietly at Guon in front of him. Their faces were so close that they could even feel each other's breath. Guon wanted to continue to retreat, but was horrified to find that he could no longer move at all. Geoise's body was like a magnet, exuding a strong suction that firmly held her body in place. Geoise's expression remained calm, and he said in a low voice, "You seem to be very confident in your own strength. You want to challenge me, right? Come on, I'm standing here now, you can make moves." How could Guon bear this? She gritted her teeth and swung the knife with all her strength. Jinpila passed through Geoise's body and cut through the air. The attack missed, and Guon was stunned. Then she remembered that Geoise was a Logia, and physical attacks without Haki could not hurt him at all. So she used armament Haki to wrap around the sword and stabbed Geoise's waist. I don't know if she has some obsession with the waist, always stabbing at this position. So she made the same mistake as Kizaru at the beginning, that is, confusing Geoise's Kamui with ordinary elementalization. The Kinpila wrapped with Haki still passed through Geoise's body without any hindrance. Guon opened her mouth slightly and blurted out, "How is this possible? I clearly used armament Haki." Geoise said nothing. He grabbed Guion's shoulder with one hand, and hit Guion's stomach with a knee strike. She immediately used armament Haki to defend, but her armament Haki was as fragile as a layer of paper in front of Geoise's attack, and was broken in an instant. Suffering a severe blow to the abdomen, Guon spurted out a mouthful of blood with a wow, and her body trembled and stepped back a few steps, and finally knelt on one leg in front of Geoise. Seeing this scene, the crowd watching the game on the field all twitched their mouths violently, thinking that Geoise had no mercy on women, and was really cruel when he started fighting. Geoise looked down at Guon and said lightly, "What's wrong with you? Do you want to admit defeat?" Guion's face showed embarrassment. Just now, she also faced Ginny with such a condescending attitude, which was absolute confidence in her own strength. But now, the roles have reversed. Her so-called confidence has been completely torn into pieces by Geoise, and the swordsmanship she was proud of couldn't even touch Geoise's clothes. Guon finally understood why Suru praised Geoise so much. In terms of the strength shown by Geoise, Suru might still be too conservative. She smiled bitterly, thinking that she had been complacent about defeating 2 students before, and now she thought about how ridiculous her performance was. The gap was too obvious. No matter how unwilling Guon was, she had to admit that she had lost, and lost completely. She held the knife with both hands and stood up from the ground. Geoise's cold face was reflected in her pair of peach-colored pupils. Guon looked at Geoise's face carefully, as if he wanted to remember this face firmly in his heart. Until Geoise showed an impatient look, she whispered, "I lost." Geoise raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect Guon to admit defeat so easily. He felt like punching cotton. With his current anger, if Guon said something stubborn again, his next blow would immediately make her lose consciousness on the spot, and she would not be able to come out without lying in the hospital for 10 days or half a month. In order to avoid falling into that violent state again, Geoise cultivated himself in Seoul for 6 years. His mind has been tempered to be very tough, and it is difficult for him to break down. But when he saw the injured Jinny, he almost couldn't control himself and almost lost control of his emotions. Only then did he really realize that Jinny was so important to him. Unknowingly, the girl who followed him all day had become an inseparable part of his life, and he would not allow anyone to hurt Jinny. Thinking of this, Geoise's hand once again emitted a thick black gas, and Guon's ponytail spread out and floated towards Geoise. The black high heels on her feet were inserted deeply into the soil. After temporarily stabilizing her figure, she murmured, "Still don't want to stop. It seems that the girl doesn't have unrequited love. Why is she suddenly envious of her?" Geoise raised his dark right hand expressionlessly and pointed it at Guon. Just as he was about to exert force, a figure wearing a marine cloak flashed past and raised his palm to meet Geoise. "Calm down, Geoise." The person who came was tall, with long dark blue hair tied into a ponytail like Guon's. He had a very capable temperament, but his face looked a little older. "She is the Vice Admiral Crane of the headquarters. Thanks to the Flying Squirrel's message, she was able to arrive in time." Of course, Flying Squirrel, who was just a student, didn't have the ability to call Crane directly, so he called Zephyr first. What surprised the Flying Squirrel was that Zephyr was still on the warship returning to his headquarters, but he didn't have time to ask these questions, so he directly told the story about Guon. "Teacher Zephyr, come back quickly. No one can stop Geoise here." Zephyr didn't say anything after hearing this, and directly informed the news to he who was at the headquarters. He was also shocked, and immediately put down what he was doing and went straight to Marine School. As soon as she arrived, she saw Geoise reaching out to Guon, and he had already used his power. He has long heard about the power of dark fruit. As far as the news from Zephyr is concerned, not even a body can be found of the pirates who died at the hands of Geoise when they went to sea this time, which is even cleaner than a Kainu's method. Although she knew that Geoise would most likely not kill him, she didn't dare to gamble. This palm of hers is not just a simple palm, this palm contains the power of washing the fruits. She wants to wash away Geoise's anger. But he was obviously too impatient. She forgot that this devil fruit ability, which needs to be used at close range, has no effect at all on Geoise, who is a dark fruit ability user. By the time he realized this, it was too late. The black energy on Geoise's hand not only did not dissipate, but became more violent. At such a close distance, her hand was tightly attached to Geoise's, making it difficult to pull away. "Crane Vice Admiral, this Guon lady wants to see my strength, so you don't have to get involved, right? Guon has already admitted defeat. I will give you an explanation later after I ask for clarification." Hearing what he said, the students on the field were shocked. "Good guy, that's Crane Vice Admiral. She actually said she would give an explanation to Geoise, a student. Is there something wrong with my ears?" His eyes flashed, and his armed color instantly covered his entire arm, and a strong thrust erupted, forcing Geoise back. After all, she is an older generation Marine. Even if she loses her fruit ability, her armament alone is not something that an ordinary Marine Vice Admiral can achieve. After breaking free from Geoise's palm, he hugged Guon behind him around his waist, carefully checked Guon's injuries, and then breathed a sigh of relief after confirming that she was fine. He couldn't help but scolded. "Guon, you are really the one who caused so much trouble for me as soon as you came here. Didn't you always say you don't like staying at the headquarters? In front of Guon looked like a little girl who had done something wrong. She lowered her head and whispered, "I've been listening to Sister He talk about how amazing the students of this class are, and there is also a genius Geoise. I couldn't help but be curious and wanted to come and see it." He was stunned for a moment after hearing this, and then sighed helplessly, thinking it was her fault. But think about it, the sister I recognized is indeed outstanding in talent. Not even the boys of her age, let alone girls, can defeat her, so only Geoise can be her opponent. It's just that Cake can't satisfy Guon in battle. With his obsession with Guon, he has to give up even before he starts. It's no wonder that Guon has always looked down on him. His numerous failed confessions are not just about his appearance. Reason. Guon, who has a strong nature, will inevitably get bored if she stays in the comfort zone outside for a long time, so after she heard that a group of students who were not weaker than appeared in the headquarters, she couldn't help but come here. Then he met Geoise, who had just returned from a mission. He was the strongest in this class, which directly shattered Guon's pride. Thinking of this, he rubbed his swollen forehead and softened his tone. "Then what's going on between you and Ginny? It's just a competition. How did the fight reach this level?" "Well, it must have been what I said before that irritated her. She has a strong temper and even grabbed my knife with her hand." Guon paused slightly when he said this, and then said, "I was careless and got hit by her, so I hit harder. Thanks to Geoise who arrived in time, otherwise it will be a big deal." He pinched Guon's little mouth. He felt happy, but at the same time he couldn't help but think that if he was seriously injured, Garp and Sengoku would probably lose their minds like Geoise. Geoise was shaken away by the crane's armed appearance and retreated directly to Ginny. Her figure was slightly swaying. Upon seeing this, Ginny hurriedly supported Geoise from behind and said anxiously, "Brother Geoise, are you okay?" "That's enough. I just hurt my hand a little." "It's okay." Geoise patted Ginny's cold little hand and said softly, "I'm fine, don't worry." After saying that, he looked up at the crane in the distance and said in a deep voice, "I still underestimated he. To be able to cultivate the armed color to such an extent is worthy of being in the same class as Sengoku and the others." After several months of training and this time going to sea for actual combat, Geoise has become very proficient in the use of weapon colors, and the intensity is not low, but he still can't do it as openly as he just did. This was also the first time that he personally experienced the intensity of the weapon's display. The power was truly extraordinary, and Crane had obviously not used his full strength. Suru is someone who has competed in Rock's Pirate with Garp, Sengoku and other top marines. She is definitely the strongest among the female marines. What's more, he is not as old as she was when she appeared in the anime. It can be said that she is in her prime. Geoise speculates that her strength is definitely infinitely close to Admiral. It is completely acceptable for Geoise to suffer such a loss in the hands of he. He is still a long way from being at the top of his combat power. After all, he has only just turned 16 years old. Geoise was thinking about something and suddenly felt a stream of hot air spraying on his hand. He looked down and found that Ginny was holding the hand he had held against he just now, pouting and blowing air on it. Geoise asked with a puzzled look on his face, "Ginny, what are you doing?" Ginny blew and replied, "Brother Geoise, your hands are a little red. They should have been shaken by the Crane Vice Admiral. I'll give you a blowjob and relax." "Idiot, I'm not that fragile. Your hand is much redder than mine." Ginny smiled and raised her injured hand as if to show off. She was in good health, and the wound on it had already scabbed over in a short while. Looking at Ginny with a smile on her face, most of the anger in Geoise's heart disappeared instantly. He pinched Ginny's pretty and elastic face and said earnestly, "Don't be brave when I'm not around in the future. We'll talk about everything when I come back. Do you understand?" Then brother Geoise, wouldn't it be great if you were always by my side? Quote. Geoise put one hand on his forehead and was about to speak to educate the stubborn Ginny, but when he saw Ginny's big watery eyes, he suddenly swallowed what he wanted to say. In the words of Blue Star, Ginny is a hopeless love brain. Geoise even laughed at this kind of girl at the time and even thought that this kind of girl could not exist at all. But when he actually met her, and the person he fell in love with was still himself, he realized how terrifying this kind of girl could be. At least he couldn't resist. Caressing Guinea's soft short pink hair, Geoise didn't know what to say anymore, so she just said, "Okay," softly. Ginny hugged Geoise's waist tightly, with a bright smile on her face. He led Guon over like a parent. She quietly observed Geoise and Ginny for a while. If Guon hadn't been scratching her palms to urge them, she might have waited until the two of them finished talking. Looking back and glaring at the funny Guon, Suru looked at Geoise and said, "Geoise, I already understand what happened. It was indeed Guon who provoked her, and her actions were not serious. I apologize to you and Ginny on her behalf." After saying that, he actually lowered his head to Geoise. Considering her identity and status, this approach was indeed very rare. Suru is such a gentle and sensible person, otherwise he wouldn't have Garp and Sengoku, two tough men, caring so much. Seeing his actions, Guon felt guilty, and he also lowered his head to apologize. Ginny suddenly felt flattered, and she bowed at 90 degrees and said repeatedly, "It's okay, it's okay. There's something wrong with me as well. I'm too serious." Seeing the performance of these three people, Geoise had nothing to say, but he still ignored Guon and just said to he. "Crane Vice Admiral, I was rude just now. You don't need to apologize. This has nothing to do with you." Crane waved his hands and was about to speak when a popping sound suddenly came from the air. Everyone looked up to the sky and saw Zephyr rushing towards here on the moonwalk, with a flash of light behind him. Zephyr shouted while kicking, "Geoise, stop it, kid. If I had known, I wouldn't have let you come back early. Porosalino, why are you dawdling behind?" After hearing this, everyone couldn't help but look at Geoise. Ginny couldn't help but ask, "Speaking of which, brother Geoise, how did you come back?" Geoise pointed to Zephyr in the sky and said casually, "It's just like Mr. Zephyr. The speed of the warship is too slow, so I used moonwalk to run back in advance." Everyone was shocked after hearing this. He frowned and asked, "Use moonwalk to run back? How long have you been running?" "It will take about a day or so. In fact, I can let the bear photograph it directly for me, but I want to take this opportunity to exercise." Crane crossed his arms, glanced at Zephyr who was preparing to land above him, and said in a deep voice, "What nonsense. You actually let a person with abilities leave the warship on the sea for a long time. What if he loses his strength or encounters a storm?" At the same time, she was once again shocked by Geoise's physical fitness. "You must know that moonwalk is not running. It consumes a lot of physical strength. It is too luxurious to use this method to travel." And Geoise actually used moonwalk to travel long distances for a day, and even managed to clean up Guon easily when he came back. Now that I think about it, this is simply outrageous. The students on the field felt much calmer than he after hearing this. In marine school, they could be said to have been with Geoise day and night, and they were already a little numb to his various extraordinary performances. "Don't ask, just ask because he is not the same type of person as us." Zephyr landed smoothly and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Crane was present and his expression was quite calm. Thanks to the flying squirrel's report, Zephyr seemed to have the situation under control. "Aha, minion," landed behind Zephyr, gradually condensing into the appearance of Kizaru. He stretched his neck, looked around, and muttered, "Crane Vice Admiral, isn't it already here? The old man just likes to be in a hurry." Flying Squirrel, who had gone to the office building to make a phone call, also ran back at this time. He was stunned when he saw that Zephyr and Kizaru had already rushed back before him. After seeing the Flying Squirrel, Zephyr directly praised him in public. "Flying Squirrel, you did a good job this time and were very considerate when things happened. But Mr. Zephyr, I just finished making a phone call, why are you back so soon?" "Well, the bear used his power to send me and Porosalino back, but the location is slightly off." "I see." At this moment, on Zephyr's warship, Akainu and Shang were sitting cross-legged on the deck. The marine soldiers standing guard around them secretly looked at the two from time to time and whispered, "Hey, Zephyr instructor and that Porosalino suddenly disappeared just now. What a magical ability. Where do you think they went? Maybe he returned to the headquarters early. After all, the mission has been completed, and this area is so close to the headquarters. Which pirate group dares to cause trouble here?" Speaking of it, this mission was completed very easily. We didn't make any effort at all. Hey, don't you look at who Zephyr instructor has brought this time. Those 4 students are more monsters than the last. Are the newcomers now so strong? Who says it's not the case? The fruit abilities of the 4 of them are so terrifying. Those pirate groups would be really unlucky when they meet them. Especially Geoise and Sakazuki. Even the Zephyr instructor can't pull down the pirates when they kill them. Live. In the past, the pirates led by Zephyr instructor basically captured them alive if they could. Afterwards, we had to escort those scum back, but now it saves a lot of trouble. Stop talking, I'm still shuddering when I think about it now. If every ability user is like them, what should we do if we encounter them in the future? What are you afraid of? Don't you feel safe with people like this in our marine? That's right. Hey, look, that Sakazuki stood up. I thought he was asleep. Next to the bear, Akainu looks a bit petite. In fact, he is already 2 meters tall, but the bear is too big. After all, he belongs to the Bacania tribe. Akainu slightly adjusted the marine hat on his head, and slowly pulled out a katana from behind. Only half of the blade of this katana was left, and the broken part was obviously melted by the high temperature. Akainu rubbed the remaining half of the blade with his hand, looking a little depressed, and whispered. My fruit ability is really not suitable for using a knife. How bad is this? Akainu suddenly became a little envious of Kizaru's ability. He could make a lightsaber out of his hands, and the power of the lightsaber was very impressive. Cutting pirates was like cutting tofu. Just looking at it made Akainu secretly happy. He can do it, but to be honest, making a knife out of magma is not as straightforward as firing a few magma punches. When he was practicing swordsmanship with Kizaru in school, he didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until he went out to sea to actually fight that he realized that swordsmanship was indeed a bit useless to him. I just want him to give up, but he is a little reluctant to give up. After all, he has really worked hard to practice before. The bear looked at him silently and said, Brother Geoise is right, you are really not suitable for using a sword. Akainu was stunned for a moment. He still attached great importance to Geoise's words and quickly asked. Did Geoise also say this? What exactly did he say? The bear hesitated for a moment and then slowly said. He said you were taking off your pants to show love. Huh, what do you mean? What a waste. Quote. The classic remark from Blue Star was immediately silenced by Akainu, but he was not angry. The words were to the point, but they sounded a bit harsh. Looking at the broken knife in his hand, Akainu looked more and more irritated. He threw the broken knife back and threw it off the deck, and finally fell into the sea. Don't tell me, after Akainu threw the knife away, he felt a sudden relief in his heart, as if a burden had been lifted, and a relaxed smile appeared on the coffin face. The bear looked at it and nodded, and suddenly said, Well, you finally put your pants on. In Geoise's absence, Shang showed his hidden venomous nature, but of course he didn't mean it. Akainu's body stiffened, but fortunately he knew that Shang was an honest man and did not mean any harm in what he said. He also helped him untie a knot in his heart, so he didn't take it to heart. If it were Kizaru, a hermaphrodite, he would have to let Kizaru know why the monkey's butt is so red. He adjusted his hat again out of habit and asked. Shang, Teacher Zephyr left in a hurry just now and didn't say what happened. Why don't we go back to the headquarters in advance and take a look? Forget it. If we leave, who will protect this place? Makes sense. Akainu agrees very much with what Shang said. How can a qualified marine leave his post without permission? Well, Geoise doesn't count, he made the report. Thinking of this, Akainu gave the bear an approving look, and then sat cross-legged next to the bear again. The two of them stopped talking and stood on the deck like two sculptures, making people feel very safe. Marine School. He finally pulled Guon away. When he reached the door, Guon suddenly looked back at Geoise. He didn't know what he said to Ginny, making Ginny giggle. On the way back, Suru saw Guon with his head lowered and remained silent, and asked. Guon, are you still thinking about the battle just now? Don't take it too seriously. Go back and practice hard. You will definitely be able to. Speaking of this, he was suddenly stunned. What she wanted to say was that Guon could defeat Geoise, but after seeing Geoise's series of performances just now, even she felt that this seemed to be an impossible task. She had to admit that Geoise was so evil. Like Sengoku and Garp, the two top marine fighters today, did they have the same strength as Geoise when he was his age? If they faced Geoise at that time, the result would probably not be any better than Guon. Now in the middle of the conversation, he was stuck there in embarrassment, not knowing how to continue speaking. Guon wasn't stupid either. She had already heard what Crane meant, but instead of being annoyed, she burst into laughter. Sister He, why don't you stop talking? In fact, you don't even believe what you are about to say, right? With his thoughts revealed, he simply said it bluntly when facing this sister with whom he had an extremely close relationship. Well, Geoise's talent is really amazing. To be honest, it's only a matter of time for him to take the position of admiral. Guon shook his head slightly and said thoughtfully, "The future Marine Admiral, is this your evaluation of him, Sister He? I'm afraid it's better to be conservative." He glanced at Guon with some surprise and continued, "Do you want to say that he can become a marshal? A marshal cannot be a marshal based on his strength alone. Judging from Geoise's character, I don't think he is suitable for this position. In today's Marine, doves are the most powerful, and Crane is a representative figure among them. Zephyr has heard about Geoise's ruthless treatment of enemies during missions. She has a conservative concept of justice and does not think Geoise is a suitable candidate for marshal." Thinking of this, he also laughed, thinking that this was too far gone. No matter how strong Geoise was, he was still just a student. Strictly speaking, Geoise didn't even have a formal military rank. Guon didn't continue to talk about this topic. She stopped and said seriously under E's doubtful eyes, "Sister He, does Marine School still accept people now? I want to enter Marine School to practice." "Well, it's okay to accept it, but now the first school year is almost over. If you want to join, you have to be included in the second class." Guon curled her lips after hearing this, then she hugged his arm and started acting coquettishly. "Sister He, with your relationship with Zephyr instructor, it shouldn't be difficult for me to be a transfer student, right? Just do this for my sister." She really couldn't resist Guon's move. She said helplessly, "No, didn't you think the headquarters was too boring before, and Garp and I were not as good as Zephyr in teaching? Why do you suddenly want to enter Marine School?" "Oh, I just want to have more contact with Geoise. With such a genius beside me to stimulate me, my strength will definitely improve very quickly." Crane looked at Guon suspiciously and asked, "Because of Geoise? I said you don't have other thoughts about him, right? Have you forgotten about Ginny? I can tell you, if you really think so, I will never agree to your request. You might as well consider adding some extra points, because even though she's not good in appearance, she's already excellent in other aspects." "Sister He, what are you talking about? I was just punished by Geoise. How could I have other thoughts about him? I really just want to make progress. And can you stop asking me for extra points all day long? It's so annoying to be around me." He stared at Guon for a long time, and Guon looked at he very openly. In the end, he gave in. She waved her hand and said, "Okay, I will tell Zephyr about this, but you have to promise me that you will not cause any trouble for me again after entering the school." As soon as he let go, Guon immediately cheered. She hugged his body and kissed he hard on the face, leaving a bright red lip mark on it. "Sister He is the best. Don't worry, I will definitely practice well in school and I will never embarrass you." Suru wiped off the lipstick marks on his face, rolled his eyes at Guon, and said, Can you be more reserved? I see that Ginny is about the same age as you. She looks so cute. How about you?" "TCH, it's just a little girl's attitude, men still like more mature women." "Just you, a mature woman. Do you want to laugh me to death?" He stopped paying attention to his already neurotic sister and left alone. Guon looked at the Crane's back, his beautiful eyes narrowed, looking like a cunning little fox. She took out a pink hairband from her arms, tied her loose hair back into a ponytail, and murmured to herself, "Sister He, just be optimistic. Women don't have to rely on strength to defeat men." A few days later, Geoise got up a little late today and left the dormitory quickly with Kizaru, who likes to get stuck. When they arrived at the training ground, it was already time to gather. He walked to his seat and stood, waiting for Zephyr's arrival. Kizaru on the side tilted his head and said, "Geoise, The old man hasn't come yet at this hour. Do you think he's getting older and started sleeping in? Geoise shook his head and whispered. No, the older you get, the less time you have to sleep. I think teacher Zephyr must be delayed by something. TCH, what can happen to him? You should retire as soon as you are old. First heard that Marine Admiral's retirement allowance is very generous. So you don't want to be an admiral? Of course. As a Marine with a righteous heart, my dream has always been to become a Marine Admiral. Akainu, who maintained a standard military posture, glanced sideways at him, and the disdainful expression on his face already expressed his meaning. When the bell rang, Zephyr finally appeared. Everyone was stunned when they saw him, because there was a slim beauty behind Zephyr. And this beauty is Guon Konami, who almost chose Marine School not long ago. In the astonished eyes of everyone, Zephyr led Guon to the front, coughed a few times and said, Dear students, we have welcomed a new member today. You should be familiar with her. Let her introduce herself. Guon walked out from behind Zephyr with his hands behind his back and a smile on his face, and said hello to the people below. Hello everyone, my name is Guon. I had some trouble with some of my classmates here a few days ago. Please don't take it to heart. Please take care of me in the future. Everyone below looked at each other, the female students were silent, and Jessica even looked at Guon with a hint of hostility. There was also no reaction from the male students. Flying Squirrel and others looked at Geoise subconsciously, and the scene was a little awkward for a while. Zephyr couldn't help but feel a little headache. To be honest, he didn't want Guon to enter Marine School if Suru hadn't come to him personally. He knew very well what was going on with the students he led. For the female students, Ginny could be said to be the favorite of the group, but not to mention the male students. They were completely led by Geoise. Although Geoise is the youngest among everyone, except for Akainu Kizaru, his strength is far ahead of the others. With such strength, coupled with a composure that belies his age, almost no male student would be dissatisfied with him. Guon happened to offend these two at the same time. To be honest, Zephyr didn't know how Guon would survive in school in the future. Looking at Guon, she didn't seem to notice anything was wrong with the atmosphere, or she could tell that everyone was a little resistant to her, but she didn't take it to heart at all. From the beginning to the end, her eyes stayed on Geoise standing in the front row, with a pair of big peachy eyes with a moving luster. Jessica pushed Ginny with her arm and whispered, Ginny, this Guon has been looking at Geoise. I feel that her motives for coming to school are a bit impure. Ginny wrinkled her beautiful eyebrows, and she naturally noticed this, but Guon had already apologized that day, and the matter was over. She is not a petty girl, and she does not want to lead others to isolate Guon because of that battle. She disdains this. So even though she felt a little uncomfortable with Guon's performance, she still said, Okay, after all, she will be our classmate from now on. It would be too rude if we don't express anything like this. After she finished speaking, Ginny took the lead in applauding, and as soon as she expressed her stance, the other girls also followed suit. Geoise looked at Ginny, who was clapping her hands vigorously over there, and couldn't help but shake her head and chuckle a few times, and also clapped symbolically. His influence was much stronger than that of Jin Nike. The originally fragmented applause suddenly became intensive, and among them, Huo Shaoshan was the most enthusiastic. Guon tilted his head, the smile on his face getting brighter. Zephyr also breathed a sigh of relief, and after telling Guon a few words, he immediately announced the start of formal training. Everyone dispersed, but Geoise, Akainu and others stayed where they were, exchanging some of their cultivation experiences during this period. Guon stood there alone, and no one came to see her. She didn't have the star-studded feeling she had when she was in the branch, and there was no entanglement from the loyal dog Licker Kaji. She didn't feel any loss at all. She gently kicked away a stone at her feet and walked slowly in the direction of Geoise. However, before she had taken a few steps, Ginny stepped in front of her again, with a friendly smile on her face and said, Guon-san, where are you going? The girls are over there. You just arrived, so I'll take you to get to know them first. After saying that, she couldn't help but hold Guon's hand, and Guon didn't resist, letting Ginny pull her and walk quickly in the opposite direction to Geoise. Looking at Ginny, who looked a little anxious, a playful look appeared on her face and she chuckled. Ginny, please walk slower. It's not convenient for me to wear high heels. Oh, I'm really sorry, but I see you wear high heels when you fight. Wouldn't that affect your movements less? You are quite tall too. Please don't wear such shoes in the future. It's too inconvenient. Haha, I think girls should wear high heels so that they look more feminine. Let me tell you, this is very lethal to men. Huh, really? Guinea's ears twitched and her steps stopped. She lowered her head and looked at the black high-heeled shoes on Guon's feet. Against the background of the shoes, Guon's exposed insteps looked so white and flawless. Looking at the plain white training shoes on her feet, Ginny couldn't help but ask. What do you mean by lethality? Guon pursed her lips and smiled. Guinea's rank was still far behind hers. She put her face close to Guinea's ear, her red lips parted lightly. Of course it hurts more to kick someone. Where did you think you were, Jin, Ni, classmate? Guinea's pretty face suddenly turned red, and she didn't know whether it was from embarrassment or itch. Realizing her gaffe, she buried her head in her pair of breasts like an ostrich, and remained silent for a long time. Guon looked down at Guinea's little pink head with a victorious smile on his face. Not far away, Jessica saw Guinea's appearance and thought she was being bullied by Guon. She ran over angrily, blocked Ginny behind her, glared at Guon and said, "Hey, what did you just do to Ginny? Let me remind you, Geoise is standing there. He hates to see Ginny being bullied the most." Guon couldn't help but look back at Geoise. Geoise was holding a long knife and slashing passionately with the lightsaber Kizaru had made, and didn't notice what was happening here. After admiring Geoise's battle for a while, Guon slowly turned around, put his hand on his waist, and said with a smile. "This classmate, you seem to have misunderstood something. I had a great chat with Ginny just now. If you don't believe me, ask her. HMPH. It's best like this. If you dare to bully Ginny, even if she doesn't say anything, I will tell Geoise and let him deal with you." "Oh, so what's your relationship with Geoise? Are we also childhood sweethearts?" What kind of relationship can I have with Geoise? It's just an ordinary classmate relationship." "Is that so? But when I heard you talking about Geoise, I thought you had a very close relationship with him." Jessica's expression froze, and she hurriedly looked back at Ginny. She was secretly relieved when she saw that Ginny had no reaction. Immediately afterwards, an inexplicable anger rose from her heart. She grabbed Guon's collar, revealing a large area of snow-white color. Fortunately, there were no male students around, otherwise there would have been a scene of soaring nosebleeds. Jessica looked directly into Guon's eyes and said in a cold voice, "Stop talking nonsense here. No matter what, Geoise and I are much closer than you, and I'm just worried about Ginny, that's all." Guon frowned, and was about to slap Jessica's hand that was holding her collar away when Geoise's voice suddenly sounded from behind her. "What are you doing?" Sensing Geoise behind him, Guon's hand that he was about to raise suddenly stopped and even turned around. The hole in his collar became wider, revealing a little bit of pink underwear. However, Geoise simply ignored this breathtaking beauty. He passed through Guon and came to Ginny, patted a bunch of pink hair on her head and asked, "Hey, silly girl, what happened?" Ginny was startled, turned away quickly, and said in a low voice, "No, it's nothing." "Then why are you keeping your head down? Have you finished today's training? Have you learned to be lazy?" "I'm not lazy. I'm going to train right now." Ginny jumped a little wildly, then suddenly became quiet again, and asked tentatively, "Brother Geoise, do you also like high heels?" "High heels? Why do you ask this suddenly?" "Oh, don't worry about it, just tell me whether you like it or not." "Well, it's okay. Do you want to wear high heels? I'll give you a pair, but I think boots are more suitable for you." "Brother Geoise, do you like me wearing boots?" "Yes, okay, I understand." Geoise crossed his arms and said to himself, "Actually, both of these shoes affect activities quite a bit. If I usually train, I don't." However, Ginny didn't listen to Geoise's next words at all. She made a face at Guon behind Geoise, then turned Jessica around and ran away, leaving behind some inexplicable words. Geoise. Guon wanted to say a few words to Geoise, but Geoise didn't even think about turning around, and disappeared in a flash. After a while, Guon became alone again. She straightened her messy collar, looked at the deep ravine and murmured to herself, What a rude man, I don't believe you can keep ignoring me like this. She looked at Ginny, who had started training in the distance, her eyes gradually narrowed. As long as we have a good relationship with that Ginny. Evening. Geoise returned to the dormitory after washing up. Akainu and Shang went to take a shower. The only one in the dormitory was Kizaru, who got into bed. He rested his head in one hand and held a banana in the other hand, tasting it as if he were eating some delicacy in the world. He brought the banana back from the canteen after dinner and specially enjoyed it as a dessert before going to bed at night. Seeing Geoise come back, he took out another one from under the pillow, threw it to Geoise very generously, and said, "Geoise, eat a banana. I got a lot from the cafeteria." Geoise took it, put the banana next to the pillow, and said with a smile, "Forget it, I just finished brushing my teeth. Let's save it for tomorrow morning." Kizaru nodded. He was not as particular as Geoise, he didn't brush his teeth at night. There is no mobile phone or anything in the pirate world. After Geoise made the bed a little bit, he was ready to go to bed. But before he lay down, the phone on the table suddenly rang loudly. This phone bug has only been installed for a few days, and only Geoise and his dormitory have it. Because the strength of the four of them has reached the general level, Zephyr no longer treats the four of them as ordinary students. If he encounters some temporary tasks, Zephyr will contact them through this phone bug and dispatch a few people to go to see with him. If Akainu was here, he would definitely be the first to pick it up due to his personality, but he was not there. Geoise glanced at Kizaru on the upper bunk opposite. Kizaru had no intention of moving at all. He looked at the ceiling and muttered, "What's the old man calling this late at night? Geoise, please pick it up. I'm a little bloated from the banana I just ate." Geoise shrugged helplessly, walked to the table and pressed the connect button on the phone bug's shell. The purple-haired phone bug began to imitate Zephyr's speech vividly. "Is it Geoise? Someone from world government is looking for you at the door. Please come over." Hearing this, Kizaru sat up suddenly on the bed and raised his ears to listen. Zephyr continued, "Don't be nervous. That man's name is Spangdine. I heard Babs say that you two had contact before when we were in Soul Country. I won't ask more about your personal affairs. You go and meet him first. Bar." Geoise nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go right away." After hanging up the phone, Geoise put on a coat and was about to go out. Kizaru suddenly stopped him and said, "Geoise, if you don't come back tonight, let us know. If you have anything to say, just tell us." Geoise was slightly startled. When he turned around, he saw Kizaru's eyes full of concern. Feeling warm in her heart, Geoise said softly, "It's okay. Didn't you listen to what Teacher Zephyr said? I know that person. Maybe my family asked him to send me something." Geoise's words could be regarded as a reminder to Kizaru that his family background was related to world government. After hearing this, Kizaru stopped saying more, nodded, and lay down slowly. Arriving at the gate of Marine School, the guard at the gate opened the gate directly when he saw it was Geoise and let Geoise go out. As soon as Geoise walked out of the door, Spangdine walked out of the shadows like a thief. He walked up to Geoise with his waist hunched over, the smile on his face as flattering as ever. "Sir Geoise, I'm really sorry, but I have to ask you to come out in person. I'm afraid that if I go in, I'll spill the beans in front of outsiders and expose your noble identity." Geoise waved his hand and said, "Okay, you did a good job. Tell me, what do you want from me?" "That's right. Lord Garin called me today and asked me to take you to Mariajoy. Uncle Jeline is looking for me. Did you say something?" "No, Sir Jeline Shang only said that he wanted to see you." Spangdine rubbed his hands, looked at Geoise with a flattering expression, and continued, "Don't worry, Lord Geoise. What I am telling the outside world is that the world government is very interested in you and wants to investigate you. After all, your outstanding performance here is obvious to all." Speaking of this, Spangdine looked at Geoise with awe, and he thought to himself, "As expected of the Fegolando family, you must know that the students of this class are personally guided by the former Marine Admiral Zephyr, and the quality of the students is definitely the best. Geoise can actually stand out among this group of people. What a talent it must be." Spangdine has come into contact with a lot of celestial dragons. To be honest, the strength of those people is not as strong as his own. He has only encountered celestial dragons like Geoise once. He increasingly felt that Geoise was a promising stock, and he became more and more devoted to Geoise. Even people like him have dreams, and his dream is to become the #1 loser around Geoise. Chapter 41. Geoise lowered his head and thought, wondering if it would be too risky to go to Mariajoy now. As a direct descendant of the Figolando family and the eldest son, Mariajoy is a place he can go whenever he wants. But who made him have such a beastly father like Guolando? Guolando must have known about the existence of his son over the years, but he has been staying in the family without making any moves. Geoise guessed that it was because of Jalin's intervention. After all, Jalin is the current head of the family. With him in Mariajoy, it is difficult for Guolando to reach out. But if Geoise is in Mariajoy, the danger level will rise sharply. Not to mention Guolando's influence in the Figolando family, in terms of his own strength, Geoise is not able to compete with him now. If it weren't for Guolando, why would Geoise come to Marine to practice? The resources of the Figolando family are not comparable to those of Marine. Thinking of this, Geoise felt a wave of confusion in his heart, and the darkness gradually spread out under his feet. Spandine, who was standing in front of him, felt his feet suddenly tighten, and then his body began to slowly sink into the darkness. The gravity of the darkness made Spandine unable to even lift his legs. He was extremely terrified, but he didn't dare to speak loudly. He trembled and said, Saint Geoise, spare my life." Spandine's fearful voice pulled Geoise's thoughts back. At this time, the darkness was almost above Spandine's waist. With a thought, the darkness instantly surged back into Geoise's body. Spandine knelt on the ground with a plop, gasping for breath. Thinking of the scene just now, Spandine was horrified. Is this the ability of Saint Geoise? It's so scary. Until Geoise reached out and pulled up Spandine, who was so scared that his body was limp, his face was still in shock. He calmed down and asked, Saint Geoise, what do you think about Mariajoy? Since Uncle Garin wants to see me, I will go back. You can leave and wait for me at the port tomorrow morning. Yes. Spandine bowed respectfully at a 90-degree angle, and his figure slowly retreated until he disappeared into the shadows. After he left, Geoise stood there in silence for a while. He slowly raised his right hand with black air rising, and said in a deep voice, What is coming will come sooner or later, and I am not someone he can easily control now. After that, a dark Uzumaki appeared behind Geoise, and then his body gradually twisted, and finally disappeared completely with the dark Uzumaki. In front of the dormitory building, in a dark corner, Dark Uzumaki reappeared and sent Geoise out. He first looked around and confirmed that he was near the dormitory building, then nodded slightly and said, The location of short-distance transmission is relatively accurate. I hope that long-distance transmission can be as stable as this. The next morning, Geoise first told his close friends that he had something to do and had to leave for a while. He didn't say what he was going to do. He just said that he would be back soon. Ginny followed Geoise to the entrance of Marine School. The soldier standing guard at the entrance only let Geoise out. He smiled and promised Ginny, I will be out for no more than a week this time. You don't have to be so nervous. I will bring you a gift when I come back. Ginny nodded obediently and said softly, Brother Geoise, I will wait for you to come back. After touching Ginny's head through the iron bars, Geoise jumped into the air and ran towards the port on moonwalk. Ginny had been watching Geoise's figure disappear from her sight, with a trace of worry on her face. When Geoise said she was going out in the morning, she noticed that Kizaru's expression was a bit strange, so she took the opportunity when Geoise was not there to pull Kizaru aside. Under her constant questioning, Kizaru finally confessed. I don't know the details, I just know that Geoise should have been called by the world government. Hearing this news, Ginny was stunned at the time. She knew a little about Geoise's life experience, so she was very clear about the risk factor of Geoise going out this time. But knowing it is knowing it, facing the behemoth of the world government, Ginny only felt a deep sense of powerlessness. Ginny wanted to go with Geoise, but she knew that she was too weak now. If something unexpected happened, she would only drag Geoise down. The only thing she could do now was to pretend that she knew nothing, at least not to upset Geoise. As she stared at the sky in a daze, a dull voice sounded. Don't worry, Ginny. If there is no news from brother Geoise, I will go directly to Mariajoy. Ginny was startled and looked sideways to find that the bear was standing not far from her, watching her silently. Bear, you. I also heard what Borsellino said. The bear raised his hand, looked at the meatball on his palm, and whispered. This ability was given to me by brother Geoise, and now it's time for it to work. After meeting Spandine at the port, Geoise boarded the ship prepared by the world government and sailed to the Holy Land of Mariajoy. Marineford is very close to Mariajoy. In less than a morning, Geoise standing on the deck could already see the red line. At the top of the red line was his destination, the Holy Land of Mariajoy. After a while, Spandine walked to Geoise with a hunched back and said respectfully, Saint Geoise, we have arrived at the red line. Please follow me to get off the boat. Geoise nodded, and Spandine immediately called a group of men in suits to escort Geoise off the boat and come to an elevator at the bottom of the red line. The elevator took Geoise and others through the clouds and stopped at the highest point. A team of guards in golden armor had been waiting here for a long time. When the elevator door opened, they saw Geoise surrounded by the center and immediately knelt on one knee and shouted, Welcome Saint Geoise. This scene shocked Spandine directly. He had come to Mariajoy more than once or twice, but he had never seen such a reception. Especially the guards in golden armor in front of him, just by looking at them, they were totally different from the suited men behind him. He had no doubt that any of those guards could easily kill the people he brought with him. Swallowing his saliva, Spandine felt that he had opened his eyes today. If it weren't for Geoise, he would probably never see these golden guards in his life. Geoise's expression remained unchanged, as this was what he should have done given his status. The golden guard kneeling at the head slowly stood up. Judging from the armor pattern, she was a woman, and she was the only woman among all the guards. She slowly came to Geoise, raised her hand and took off the heavy golden helmet on her head. Her long black hair spread like a waterfall. She looked at Geoise and said softly, Master Geoise, I am the captain of the third team of the Fegalando family guards, Lucia. I wonder if you still remember me. Geoise was stunned for a moment. He began to search for previous memories in his mind, and at the same time looked at the woman named Lucia in front of him. She doesn't look very old, and the thick armor can't hide her exquisite curves. The exposed skin above her neck is as smooth as white jade, and her delicate face has a pair of big amber eyes. But if you look closely, there is a small scar under her left eye. It is this scar that reminds Geoise of her. That was what happened before Geoise was experimented by Gulandola. Before the age of 6, he lived a pampered life in the palace like other celestial dragons, and Lucia was a slave that Garen bought at an auction during a trip to the Sabayati archipelago. Galen didn't have any special hobbies. He fell in love with Lucia because when the host introduced her, he said she was a princess. Lucia's original country was a non-franchised country. Because it was too weak, it was destroyed by a group of pirates. Almost everyone in the royal family except Lucia was killed by the pirates. After she was discovered by the pirates hiding under the bed, she was sold to the auction house along with some treasures by the pirates. Born into a royal family, she stood out among the slave children at that time. Galen took a liking to her at a glance and bought her as a 4th birthday present for Geoise. The family tradition of the Fegalando family is much better than that of other celestial dragons, and Geoise was only 4 years old at the time. What bad thoughts could a 4-year-old have? Lucia was very afraid of this boy who was 3 years younger than her at first, because she had heard about the cruelty of celestial dragons from her parents since she was a child. Even the so-called king was an ant that could be easily crushed to death in their eyes. However, Geoise did not treat her as a slave at all. He had been imprisoned deep in the clan by Gulando since birth, and he finally met a child about his age, so he naturally cherished her very much. He would let Lucia sit next to her during meals and would often yell for Lucia to play some childish games with him that he heard from the nanny. Geoise remembers that he and Lucia played house at the time. Since there were only 2 of them, they simply pretended to be a couple. At first, Geoise often called Lucia sister. Lucia's mind is more mature than Geoise. She knew that she could not let Geoise call her that. If this kind of thing spreads, no matter how good the relationship between the 2 is, someone will make her, a humble slave, disappear from Geoise forever. The two spent 2 years of peaceful time together. Not only was Lucia not tortured by the inhumans in her imagination, but under the influence of Geoise, she gradually opened her closed heart. She even thought that it would be nice to stay with Geoise and be a slave for the rest of her life. But things didn't go as she wished. One day when Geoise was 6 years old, Guon suddenly came to Geoise with a guy with a huge head and weird appearance. Geoise was listening to Lucia reading to him at the time. When he saw Guon, before he could call his father, he was grabbed by Guon around his waist and taken away in confusion. Lucia has not seen Geoise for a long time since then, and she was suddenly enveloped in fear after losing Geoise. Only then did she realize that the huge Figalandu family was a prison to her, and she became that little girl again whose country was ruined and her family was ruined. Geoise has always been the light that illuminated her, but now the light has disappeared. Her only hope every day was that she would suddenly see Geoise come back, and then she would hold Geoise tightly in her arms and tell him her fears and longings. But she waited day after day, and Geoise didn't come back in the end. Even the news about Geoise seemed to have become taboo in the Figalandu family. But she didn't give up until one day, two strangers in white coats passed by her while she was cleaning the yard. The two men were dressed in the same attire as the strange man standing next to Guon. Lucia immediately and quietly approached the two men and vaguely heard what the two were talking about. "Oh, a gene has just been injected into it and it's like this. I really don't know how long that child can survive. That's already a miracle. Well, that kid is still a celestial dragon's. I really don't understand what's going on. Stop talking. This is not our business. We are just two assistants. We just need to do what Dr. Vegapunk says." Snapped. The broom in Lucia's hand fell to the ground. She ran up with all her strength, stopped in front of the two of them, and asked in a trembling voice. "Are you talking about Lord Geoise?" The expressions of both of them changed. One of them glared at Lucia fiercely, and then pulled the other one away quickly. Lucia stood there blankly until the head waitress came over to urge her. She suppressed the fear in her heart and continued to work despite the female officer's scolding. When it was time to finish work in the evening, she did not go back to the residence with the other servants but found an excuse and ran away. Her usual area of activity was only the place where Geoise lived. She followed the direction the two men walked during the day until a pure white building appeared in her sight. She hid behind a flower bed and did not dare to move forward because there were two guards in golden armor standing there. But when she turned around to leave, a heart-piercing shout suddenly came from the white building. "Let me out, father, why are you doing this to me?" The voice was hoarse, but Lucia recognized it immediately as Geoise's voice. The two guards at the door were used to it. One of them laughed and said casually, "Our Lord Geoise has started again." Listening to the sound, it seems that the dose of medicine injected today is a bit large. "Hey, you won't hear it soon. A child can survive such an experiment until now. Should he be said to be a bloodline of the Figalandu family? Wait a minute, did something run over there just now?" When the two guards arrived at the flower bed where Lucia had been hiding, there was no one there, except for a few drops of water on the ground that were almost dry. Lucia ran back to her apartment crying, covered herself with a quilt, and tried her best not to cry. She doesn't know Geoise's situation. She only knows that Geoise is suffering from great pain and may even lose his life at any time. Recalling every little moment of getting along with Geoise, her heart became increasingly sad. After a sleepless night, Lucia went out to work the next day with red and swollen eyes. She cleaned the courtyard with empty eyes, and Geoise's painful screams still seemed to echo in her ears. Since Geoise was taken away, no one has come to this courtyard, but Lucia has just arrived today when a sound of heavy footsteps comes from far away. They are the two men in white and a golden armor guard from yesterday. They walked to stand in front of Lucia. The golden armored guard pointed at Lucia, whose height had just reached his knees, and said coldly, "Is this her you are talking about?" The two men in white nodded repeatedly. The more they thought about it after they went back yesterday, the more scared they became. They were afraid that Lucia would reveal the contents of their conversation and implicate themselves. So they found a golden armored guard in charge of monitoring the laboratory and said that a slave had overheard the secret. Hearing that the target was just a humble slave, the golden armored guard didn't take it seriously and came directly with the two men in white. The golden armored guard's eyes were calm, and he asked first. Kid, who is your master? Lucia was a little scared at first, but after hearing this, she raised her head and said firmly. My master is Geoise. The golden armored guard nodded slightly after hearing this, thinking in his mind. Geoise's slave, isn't that the same as being a slave without an owner? It would be much easier to deal with such a slave. He grabbed the clothes on Lucia's back, lifted her up roughly, and said coldly. Oh, that's easy. You heard some bad things yesterday and now I have to shut you up forever. After saying that, he ignored the two men in white and carried Lucia outside. The Fegalando family has a rule that if you want to execute a slave, you have to go outside, and you cannot let the lowly blood pollute the noble land of the Fegalando family. She was alone, and the only thing she cared about was Geoise. The Fegalando family has a very large territory. The golden armored guard carried Lucia through several courtyards in a swagger. When he passed a palace, a majestic voice stopped him. Zephyr, where are you going? The body of the golden armored guard named Zephyr froze. He slowly turned his head and saw Geoise sitting on a chair inlaid with various gems, crossing his arms and looking at him indifferently. The moment Zephyr saw Guon, he immediately knelt down on one knee, lowered his head and said. Lord Geoise, this slave has committed a capital crime, and my subordinates are about to take her out and deal with her. Guon glanced at Lucia, who was being held by Zephyr, and raised his eyebrows, feeling that she looked familiar. He stood up from the chair, slowly walked to the kneeling Zephyr, looked down at Lucia and asked. May I have your name? Lucia lowered her eyes and replied mechanically. Lucia, this kind of neither salty nor bland attitude is absolutely disrespectful to a slave. Zephyr raised his eyebrows, threw Lucia to the ground, and scolded. You brat, how dare you speak to Lord Geoise like this? Zephyr's force was so strong that Lucia felt as if her whole body was falling apart, but she still struggled to get up from the ground and looked into Zephyr's eyes without fear. Lucia's performance made Zephyr furious. If Guon hadn't been around, he would have killed this disrespectful slave immediately. But Guon remembered Lucia's origin. Wasn't this the birthday gift he bought for Geoise? He asked. I remember you are Geoise's slave, right? What crime have you committed? At the mention of Geoise, the suppressed anger in Lucia's heart burst out instantly, and she shouted at Guon. You care what crime I have committed? If you want to kill me, just kill him. Even Master Geoise is locked up and tortured by you, so what am I, a slave? Huh, what did you say? Geoise frowned, and Zephyr on the side felt bad after seeing it. He didn't care about the rules anymore. He turned his palm into a knife and slashed at Lucia's neck. Bang! With a muffled sound, Zephyr was kicked away by Guon, and his body slid out against the ground. He stood up with difficulty while holding the dented armor on his chest. As soon as he raised his head, he saw Geoise's cold face. His body slowly exuded an aura that was as domineering as the ultimate. Under the pressure of this aura, Zephyr's feet the ground began to crack. Did I let you move? Guon didn't make any move, but Zephyr felt as if he had been hit hard. He knelt down on his knees with a bang and shouted with a look of panic. It's me who deserves to die. Lord Geoise, please spare your life. Guon ignored him. He turned to look at Lucia and said in an unquestionable tone. Tell me what happened. It only took a moment from Zephyr's attack to being knocked to the ground. Lucia still stood there blankly before she could react. Guon was already very impatient, and his aura suddenly increased, and he directly pressed Zephyr to the ground, letting out a scream. Lucia finally woke up and saw Zephyr's miserable condition. She vaguely felt that things seemed to have turned around, so she gave it a try and told everything she had seen and heard yesterday. Guon listened quietly, the expression on his face getting darker. After Lucia finished speaking, he walked up to Lucia without saying a word and said coldly. You should still remember the location of that place, take me there. Lucia nodded vigorously and hurriedly ran forward to lead the way for Guon. Guon didn't even look at Zephyr on the ground and walked over on his body. Arriving in front of the white building where Geoise was imprisoned, the remaining golden armored guard at the door saw the ugly-looking Geoise and hurriedly knelt down to salute. Geoise just looked at the door in front of him. With his excellent hearing, he had already heard the moans coming from inside the door. It was his nephew Geoise. Without waiting for the guard to open the door, he punched out and the thick iron door exploded like a fragile mirror, revealing the scene inside. On a big snow-white bed, Geoise was lying on the bed covered with needles. Surrounded by a group of frightened people in white, there was also Guon, who had a face similar to Galen's, but his hair was like a cone. Geoise raised his head with difficulty after hearing the noise. He looked at Galen and Lucia at the door and murmured in pain. "Uncle Galen, Lucia, save me." Looking at the angry Geoise lying on the bed in front of her, tears burst out of Lucia's eyes. She yelled, "Lord Geoise," and was about to rush over. Galen grabbed her and looked at Guon, asked coldly, "Guon, what on earth are you doing? Didn't you say you were treating Geoise? What disease has not been cured for so long? And you made Geoise look like this." Grando placed a tube of green injection in his hand on Geoise's bed and responded calmly. "Why are you here to care about this if you don't practice hard? Geoise is very ill. How can it be so easy to cure? It hurts me to see him like this every day. He is my biological son." Guon deliberately emphasized the last few words, with the obvious intention of telling Garen not to come and meddle in other people's business. Geoise struggled to speak on the bed. Guon held his mouth and whispered, "Poor child, you'd better stop talking and take a good rest." Galen's eyes flashed. He didn't know whether what Guon said was true or false, so he could only stand there silently. Seeing that Galen had calmed down, Grando's lips curved into a hidden smile. Just as he was about to ask Galen to leave, Lucia, who was pulled by Galen, suddenly shouted, "He's lying. I heard it all yesterday. What experiments are these people doing on Geoise?" Grando frowned, held the crescent-shaped pendant on his chest, and pulled out a mini knife. He held the knife and slashed it through the air, and a sword energy burst out towards Lucia. Court death. Aha! At this critical moment, Geline also pulled out the sword from his waist and blocked the flying sword energy. But because he took action in a hurry, the aftermath of the sword energy dissipated still affected Lucia, who was standing next to him, leaving a thin line of blood under her left eye. Lucia was indeed unaware of the bright red blood flowing out from the wound. She tightly grabbed the hem of Galen's clothes and begged, "Please take Lord Geoise away, he will die if this continues." Galen was upset by Lucia's shouting. He threw Lucia away. Before he could speak, Geoise on the bed suddenly opened his eyes when he saw the injured Lucia. A violent electric current burst out from his body and said angrily, "Lucia." Guon quickly stopped his hand. He stared blankly at his palm, which was slightly blackened by the electricity, and suddenly fell into a state of madness. "Ha ha ha, it worked. I succeeded." Garen was shocked by the scene in front of him. He stared at Guon and asked, "What the hell is going on? Did you really do some kind of experiment on Geoise? You better tell me clearly." Grando stopped laughing, tilted his head and looked at Galen, and said, "Garen, are you, my younger brother, ordering me? You are not the head of the family yet." Galen pointed his sword at Guon and responded stiffly, "So what, have you forgotten that as the leader of the Knights of God, I have the power to judge the celestial dragons? Now, I want you to tell me exactly what you did." Guon was stunned for a moment, then he covered his face and laughed. "Ha ha ha ha, yes, the leader of the Knights of God is so majestic." Smiling, the expression on Guon's face became more ferocious. He suddenly looked into Garen's eyes and said through gritted teeth, "That position should be mine. Stop showing off to me. Don't you want to know what I did? Okay, I'll tell you." He lowered his head and looked at Geoise, who was already stunned, and said in a feminine voice, "I admit that even if I practice more, it is difficult to surpass you in strength, but I have a good son, his talent is stronger than yours, you say, how can I waste such a body?" As he said, Guon gently touched Geoise's forehead with his hand. His hand was not cold, but Geoise shuddered. Geoise's body is like a piece of unpolished jade, which needs to be carefully developed. For this, I have put a lot of effort. He walked to a table, grabbed a report from it and threw it to Garen, saying, "Take a look, this is a genius design." Garen took the report and only read 2 pages. A chill came out of his heart. He threw the report to the ground and glared at Guon and shouted, "You are crazy. Geoise is just a child, how can he bear this kind of experiment?" Gulando snorted coldly and said, "My child is not your turn to care about. If you have nothing to do, don't disturb my research here." Guon had no intention of leaving. He approached Gulando with a sword and said word by word, "Leave Geoise to me, you are not worthy of being a father." Facing the angry Guon, Gulando looked surprisingly calm. He held his arm and said frivolously, "Oh, I almost forgot, you are going to be a father soon, right?" Click. The floor was cracked by Jalan's step. He stopped suddenly and looked at Gulando in disbelief, saying, How did you? How do I know? Haha, my good brother, you only know how to practice all day long. How many things in the family do you know? What little thing can be hidden from my eyes?" Jaline looked ugly, and he stood there with his sword. Gulando sneered a few times and continued, "I advise you not to meddle in other people's business. Otherwise, if that matter spreads out, I'm afraid you will not be able to be a father anymore." You. Jalan's lips trembled with anger. At this moment, he really wanted to chop Gulando with a sword, but Gulando's words really caught his vital point. Gulando slowly walked to Guon, patted his shoulder, and whispered, "Don't be so nervous, we cannot interfere with each other, and besides, my experiment is of great benefit to Geoise, how can I joke with my son's life?" Guon tightly grasped the hilt of the sword, gritted his teeth and said, "How long will your experiment take?" "Soon. Didn't you see the current burst out of Geoise just now? This shows that the direction of my experiment is correct. As long as I give me some time, I can create the most perfect body in the world for him." At this point, Gulando silently added in his heart, "It's also for myself." Guon closed his eyes, slowly exhaled a breath of turbid air, then he turned around and pulled Lucia away from here. After leaving the lab, Lucia was still crying and begging Jaline to save Geoise. Jaline turned his head away and said coldly, "Don't cry. You are very loyal to your master, which is very good. I will arrange you to join the guard team. Practice hard there. When Geoise comes back, you can be his personal guard." Lucia accepted Guon's arrangement and joined the Fegolando family's escort team, training desperately every day. Her idea is simple. If Geoise never comes out by then, at least she can still do something with her own strength. But Geoise couldn't hold on in the end and died in the laboratory at the age of 8. Naturally, this kind of thing would not be publicized. Only a few people in the Fegolando family and others knew about it. Several heavyweights in celestial dragons. Lucia didn't know Geoise was dead, but that was a good thing for her. Geoise is the motivation for her to practice hard. If she had known about it, she might not be alive now. The happiest day for her in these years was when Galen came back from the Valley of the Gods and specifically told her that Geoise had come out. However, due to some special reasons, he could not return to Mariajoy for the time being. Although she was a little regretful, after hearing the news, a huge stone in Lucia's heart finally fell, and she became more motivated to practice. She looked forward to the day when she would meet Geoise. It wasn't until this day 6 years later that Jaline found her again and told her that Geoise was coming back. Now that she had become the captain, she was so happy that she went crazy. She brought her men here before dawn to wait for Geoise. When the elevator door opened, she immediately saw Geoise standing in the center. The little kid who called her Lucia's sister has now become a tall and handsome young man. Maybe it was too long. Geoise didn't seem to recognize her after she took off her helmet, but it didn't matter. Lucia felt that her years of waiting were worth it, and her Geoise saint stood by her again in front of. The memory of Lucia gradually became clearer in his mind, and Geoise looked at Lucia with gentler eyes. He remembered the girl who broke into the laboratory next to Galen. He raised his hand and gently touched the scar under Lucia's left eye. Lucia's body trembled and she looked at Geoise blankly. "Lucia, I'm back." Geoise's voice was not loud, but it was like a heavy hammer hitting the softness deep in Lucia's heart. At this moment, her big amber eyes were filled with tears. Because this is Mariajoy with a strict hierarchy, she resisted the urge to hug Geoise and said with a smile, "Young master, welcome home." Geoise nodded slightly, and the two looked at each other for a long time. The golden armored guards brought by Lucia remained motionless, and no one raised their heads. Spangdine in the back didn't even dare to take a breath, let alone the remaining men in suits. Anyone who knows anything knows that keeping his head down and counting ants is the wisest choice at this time. Reaching out his hand to wipe away the tears from the corner of Lucia's eyes, Geoise said softly. Take me to see Uncle Geline. Lucia hummed softly. When she turned around, the expression on her face instantly became cold, and she ordered to the guards kneeling on the ground. Line up and send the young master home. As soon as he finished speaking, the guards stood up one after another and lined up in 2 rows behind Geoise. The whole process was orderly. Spangdine swallowed, jumped behind the guard and shouted, Lord Ji Geshung, I will wait for you on the boat. At this time, no one responded to him, and Geoise and his party had already walked away in a mighty way. From time to time, celestial dragons riding slaves passed by on the road, and they immediately started talking when they saw the battle. Hey, isn't that the Fegalando family's exclusive guard? Who is the guy at the head? Who knows? Hey, isn't that Lucia? She's getting more and more beautiful. It would be great if I could have her by my side. Just think about it. Saint Geline publicly said that the woman was prepared for his nephew, Saint Geoise. Sage Geoise, if you didn't tell me, I would have almost forgotten about him. He is said to be a direct descendant of the Fegalando family, but he has never been seen before. I don't know if this person exists. That's right, my father told me that this generation of the Fegalando family has not yet produced an heir. Saint Garin and Saint Gulando don't seem to be very interested in women. If this continues, I'm afraid the Fegalando family will disappear. It's best to disappear, then won't all their resources be shared with us? The unscrupulous voices of several celestial dragons came, Geoise's expression remained unchanged, and Lucia sneered a few times with disdain, thinking that no matter how much the Fegalando family declines, they are not something you can covet. After staying in the Fegalando family for so many years, she still feels that what she has seen is just the tip of the iceberg of this family. And now Lord Geoise is back. As long as he is around, the Fegalando family will continue to pass on. Unfortunately, I can't help in this matter. Thinking of her status as a slave, a sad look appeared on Lucia's face. Lucia, your face doesn't look good. What are you thinking about? Lucia raised her head to face Geoise, who looked concerned, shook her head quickly and said, It's okay, young master. I just felt a little sad for the young master after hearing what those people said. Feel sorry for me? Well, the young master is obviously the only heir of the Fegalando family, and his status is so noble, but when something like that happens, the glory that should belong to you has never really been obtained until now. Although what Lucia said was not what she just thought, it was also her sincere words. Geoise sighed softly after hearing this, raised his eyes and looked forward, and said, Aren't you the same? I remember Uncle Geline told me that you were once the princess of a country. If the country had not been destroyed, you would be much happier now than in this so-called Holy Land. Lucia didn't expect that Geoise would still think of her. A complex emotion brewed in her heart, and she murmured with trembling lips, Little Lord. Geoise didn't look at her and continued, Lucia, I heard you just said that you are now the captain. You are really excellent, but I want to say that you must have suffered a lot in these years. Lucia could no longer control the strong emotions in her heart. Regardless of the shocked eyes of the people around her, she finally threw herself into Geoise's arms and cried bitterly. Lord Ji Geshung, I really miss you. Where have you been all these years? Geoise caressed Lucia in her arms and said, First in a country called Solbay for 6 years, and now with Marine. Marine, young master, why do you want to go to Marine in your capacity? Hee. Geoise looked at the Fegalando family residence that was gradually becoming clearer in front of him, and said lightly, Of course it's to gain strength. Otherwise, wouldn't I be living up to his expectations of me? Lucia was slightly startled, but she quickly realized who the he in Geoise's mouth was referring to. She held Geoise's hand tightly and said firmly, Young master, because of his identity, it's hard for you to take action. If the day comes, I will kill him for you. Geoise shook his head, and black energy gradually rose from his body, saying, From the day he experimented on me, he is no longer my father. His life must be taken by me personally. Lucia fell silent after hearing this, and Geoise said no more until they arrived at the residence of the Fegalando family. It is said to be a family residence, but in fact the scale is far larger than the palaces where kings live outside. Under the leadership of Lucia, Geoise walked for a long time before arriving at the depths of the residence. This is the palace of the head of the Figolando family. A middle-aged man with hair and beard forming a crescent shape stood at the door of the palace. The man had an aura of calmness and authority. Regardless of the weird hairstyle, his facial features and facial contours are similar to Geoise, a bit like a middle-aged version of Geoise. He is the born king, the current head of the Figolando family, Saint Geline. The moment Geoise stepped into this territory, Jalin's eyes narrowed, and a substantial momentum burst out from him. The golden armored guards behind Geoise were instantly suppressed and fell to their knees. Lucia, who was stronger, also had a look of pain on her face. Only Geoise's expression looked calm, but judging from the sweat beads on his forehead, he wasn't feeling that well now either. Looking at the stagnant Geoise who was oppressed by the momentum, Geline raised his feet and walked down the steps step by step, saying in a deep voice, "Geoise, is it just not enough at this level? Is this the result of your training in naval headquarters? Didn't you just say you wanted to take revenge yourself?" Geoise was shocked. When he said this, he had not even reached the gate of the station. Geline could hear his voice deep inside the station. If it weren't for Blue Star's memory, Geoise would have even suspected that Geline had eaten the thunder fruit and developed the hard network. However, the effects of observation hockey vary from person to person. Effects such as predicting the future and listening to the voices of all things are also understandable. It can only be said that Garen's strength is really unfathomable. Not only Conqueror's hockey, but also observation hockey has cultivated to such a terrifying state. Now as Garen approaches step by step, Geoise feels more and more pressure, and Lucia beside him is gritting her teeth and persisting. "Master Ji Geshung." Lucia finally couldn't hold on any longer, and a trace of bright red blood overflowed from the corner of her mouth. Geoise's eyes narrowed when he saw it. He pulled Lucia into his arms, and darkness-like tentacles emerged from behind him, all rushing towards Geoise. "Forest." Geline meant to stop completely. He snorted coldly, his aura increased again, and he directly blasted away the dark tentacles that came towards him. His terrifying momentum made Geoise feel as if he had been hit hard. Lucia, who was holding him in his arms, bent forward and almost fell to her knees. Galen walked up to him and said condescendingly, "Is that the end?" At this time, Geoise's eyes have turned into darkness. In fact, he can use Kamui to avoid the impact of conquerors, but if he chooses to escape like this, then his so-called revenge will really become a complete joke. Looking at Geoise who was holding on and not falling down, a hint of approval flashed in Jalin's eyes. He had not seen Geoise since the Valley of the Gods, and he wanted to investigate Geoise. Although he seemed to be disappointed with Geoise, Galen was actually very satisfied with Geoise's performance. The conquerors that Garen is releasing now are not just a mental shock, his conquerors can cause substantial damage. After all, he is one of the top combat powers in the pirate world. In terms of conquerors' achievements, even the red-haired Shanks behind him may not be able to surpass him. Geoise can withstand his conqueror's impact at the age of 16, which shows that he definitely has the qualifications to be a king. Seeing that Geoise was almost unable to hold on any longer, Geline was about to take back conquerors. Suddenly, Geoise, who had been lowering his head, murmured to himself, "How could it be like this? It's over." After Geoise shouted these words, something seemed to shatter deep in his soul, and then, a jet-black aura mixed with lightning burst out from Geoise. Buzz. Lucia felt her body light up in Geoise's arms, and her somewhat vague consciousness gradually recovered. She raised her head and looked around, only to see a black semicircular shield covering her and Geoise's bodies. Inside. She widened her eyes and looked at Geoise with surprise and said, "Young master, have you awakened conquerors?" Geoise smiled and nodded. He straightened his body again, looked directly into Jalin's surprised eyes and said, "Uncle Geline, is this the meeting gift you gave to your nephew?" Geline was also shocked by Geoise's sudden awakening. He calmed down, took back conquerors and said, "Yes, this is the qualification that the Figolando family should have. Welcome home, Figolando Geoise Saint." Geoise was slightly focused, and was about to respond when Lucia, who was in his arms, suddenly snorted. Geoise was startled by her voice and quickly lowered his head and asked, "What's wrong, Lucia? Are you injured?" Lucia looked up at Geoise with a blushing face and said softly, "I'm fine, it's just that the young master's strength is a bit too strong, and I'm a little short of breath." Geoise was stunned for a moment, and then realized that his arms were tightly wrapped around Lucia's chest, almost pressing her into a pancake shape. Feeling the soft touch on her arm, Geoise coughed twice and wanted to let go of Lucia. Sensing Geoise's movements, Lucia held down Geoise's arm, lowered her head and said in a low voice, "Master, please wait a moment. My body is a little weak. Can you hold me up for a moment?" Lucia said so. How could Geoise refuse? He simply moved his hand to Lucia's waist, let him lean against his body, and said, "Then just follow me in." It doesn't work. In fact, I can still hold on for a while. Okay, you are my person, I cannot allow you to refuse. The impact of these words on Lucia was comparable to Conqueror's, and now her body really went completely limp. Galen watched silently the whole time, until Lucia leaned on Geoise's shoulder and said honestly, "Let's go, I have something to give you. It can be regarded as a homecoming gift from my uncle to my nephew." Geoise only took Geoise into his bedroom. After the two left, the golden-armored guards who had been lying on the ground for a long time were able to get up from the ground with a gasp, and looked at the backs of Geoise and Geoise in awe. People are really different. Some people are born to be kings. Entering the palace, Geoise looked at the environment around the palace. Except for some decorations, both the furniture and the walls were spotless white, which was different from the gorgeousness he imagined. As the residence of the head of the Fegalando family, this place seems a bit too simple. Galen led the way without saying a word. His bedroom was very large and even had stairs leading underground. When they got underground, a black door appeared in front of Geoise. For some reason, Geoise suddenly felt weak. The closer he got to the door, the stronger the feeling of weakness became. Geoise had to force himself to get to the door. There was nothing strange about Geoise. He turned around, glanced at Geoise, and said, "Do you feel like your whole body is paralyzed?" Geoise pressed his hands on the wall to barely support his body. He nodded slightly and asked, "Is this door made of sea stone?" "Yes, it is very pure and has a strong restraint on people with abilities. It can even cause people with abilities to lose their abilities without touching it. At the same time, it is also one of the hardest substances in the world." Geoise tried to activate his ability and found that, as Geoise said, not even a trace of black energy was produced in his body, and he could not use the power of dark fruit at all. Not only was he unable to use his abilities, but it also made Geoise's body even weaker, staggering and almost falling to the ground. Geoise had anticipated this situation and stepped forward to help Geoise. Geoise's breathing was a little rapid and he said, "I'm sorry, Uncle Geoise, I really can't muster the strength." Galen chuckled, shook his head and said, "No need to apologize, your performance is already very good. Gulando's performance back then was even worse than what you are doing now. Is he a capable person? He wasn't before he came here. He took the devil fruit from inside the door, Paramesha blood fruit." Geoise narrowed his eyes slightly. This was a strange fruit to him. But one thing he knows very well is that since this fruit was taken out from the secret room of the Fegalando family, its power will definitely not be inferior to those fruits in the Valley of Gods. Galen's next words also confirmed this. The last head of the family, your grandfather, was a user with the ability of the blood fruit. After his death, the family spent a lot of effort to recover this fruit. Gruondo fell in love with this fruit. I just give it to him. Geoise really had no impression of his grandfather, because no one in his family had mentioned it since he could remember. He couldn't help but ask. The power of this fruit should be very strong. Why didn't Uncle Geoise think of eating it himself? Galen shook his head and said, I have no interest in devil fruit, and the power of this fruit is too evil. It will corrode the mind of the Esper. My father went completely crazy just a few years after becoming an Esper. If he hadn't recovered at the last moment some consciousness, I have no chance at all. Galen stopped when he said this, with a look of pain on his face. Although he did not continue, Geoise also guessed that Geoise most likely killed his father with his own hands. Thinking of this, Geoise's expression was a little strange, because in the future, he would also kill his father. It's just that in the matter of patricide, Galen was forced, but he took the initiative. At this moment, the uncle and nephew Geoise and Geoise fell into a state of silence. After a while, Geoise took the initiative to speak. If this fruit is so dangerous, why did you give it to him? Galen sighed and said, Gulindo has always been worried about me taking over as the leader of the Knights of God. After I became the head of the family and had the right to control this secret room, he proposed to get this fruit. Originally, I didn't agree. Quote. Geoise curled his lips and thought, so you gave him the fruit anyway. Thinking that Gulindo's strength would be improved again, Geoise felt a little unhappy and asked casually. What, could it be that he knelt down for you? Geoise choked at these words. He glared at Geoise angrily and said. With his character, how could he kneel down to me? He promised me that as long as I give him this fruit, he will not interfere with you anymore, and I also wanted to ease the relationship with him, so I finally agreed. Quote. Jalen's voice sounded calm and gentle, but it made Geoise's body tremble slightly. He finally understood why Gulindo had no intention of doing anything to him after he had been outside for so many years. Jalen's words touched Geoise very much. As a man in 2 lifetimes, this was the first time that he truly felt the existence of family affection. Thinking of Jalen's silent attention and help to him over the years, Geoise looked at Geoise and said softly. Uncle Geoise, thank you. Geoise was stunned. Although this was not the first time Geoise called him uncle, he could clearly feel that the emotions contained in it were completely different. Because of his childhood experience, Geoise not only hated Gulindo, but also became hostile to the entire Figolando family. Therefore, even though Geoise has been helping him, there is still a gap in his heart. But now, after knowing what Geoise has done for him, the barrier in Geoise's heart has completely disappeared. Galen was still very happy, but he had been quite rigid since he was a child and rarely showed his true feelings. To put it simply, he is not good at expressing himself. He turned his face awkwardly, and in the end only 3 words came out. You're welcome. After saying that, without waiting for Geoise to respond, he carried him directly to the door, took out a golden key from his arms and inserted it into a secret slot on the door. Galen turned the key, and there was a muffled sound from the door. Then he pressed his hand on the door and pushed a little harder, and the 2 heavy doors slowly opened. Just from the sound, he knew that the door was heavy. Geoise couldn't help but think that if it were him, he wouldn't have the strength to open the door even if he had the key. So what should I do when I become the head of the family? Do I have to bring Lucia with me every time I come here? There was a tangled expression on Geoise's face. It was okay to bring Lucia with her. Lucia was one of her own. But what he struggled with was that he would have to lean into Lucia's arms as weakly as a little girl, and then let Lucia open the door for him. This was really a bit embarrassing. After the door opened, Geoise continued to carry Geoise inside. Geoise suddenly asked, Uncle Geoise, has Grandpa never come here since he became a capable person? Or does he always bring you to open the door for him? Geoise was stunned for a moment, and then he quickly reacted. He smiled and said, have you thought about the day when you will become the head of the family? You think about it very far. I am not dead yet. Well, that's not what I mean. Besides, it doesn't mean that I have to die without you. Maybe you will retire early if you are tired of it. Hee, do you think the position of head of the family is the same as those positions in Marine? Retirement, have you heard of a retired head of the family? Well, that's true. It's better for me not to be the head of the family. I don't want Uncle Geoise to die. The last sentence is definitely Geoise. The 2 of them said a few words like bickering, and Geoise gradually let go. He said more, you still have some conscience. Don't worry, the position of the head of the family will be yours sooner or later. As for the problem you just mentioned, it is not impossible to solve it. It depends on whether you are qualified to accept this gift from me. If Geoise hadn't said it, Geoise almost forgot about the gift. Because the distance from the Seastone Gate was getting farther and farther, Geoise gradually recovered some mobility. He broke away from Geoise, moved his body slightly, and began to look at this secret room. As a wealthy family in Celestial Dragons, the Figolando family naturally has countless treasures in the secret room. Things like gold and jewelry can be seen everywhere here like cabbage. It is conservative to describe it as a gold mountain. From this way of display, it can be seen that the Fegalando family did not take these things seriously at all. The truly precious ones are the famous swords hanging on the wall, but not all swords are qualified to be hung on the wall. Geoise saw a few knives casually placed in a corner, with a sign next to them that read, "Good sharp knife 50 gong." There was a label on the handle, which should be the name of the knife. The one that was qualified to be hung on the wall was, "Big sharp knife 21 gong." Geoise counted and found a total of 5. This number is already very amazing. After all, there are only 21 knives of this level in the world, and the Fegalando family directly accounts for nearly a quarter of them. This background is definitely very terrifying. What's funny is that Geoise, the heir of the family, actually saw the strength of his family for the first time. Geoise looked back and saw Geoise's eyes lingering on those famous swords. He raised a playful smile and asked, "It seems that you are very interested in swords." Geoise retracted his gaze and answered honestly, "Those swords are indeed very tempting, but my swordsmanship is really average. It would be a waste to give me a good sword." "How dare you say that? Do you know that the people in our family are best at swordsmanship? Swordsmanship can be said to be the foundation of our family." Geoise shook his head helplessly and said, "There is no way. There are people in Marine who can use swords, but there are no really powerful ones. I just learned some basics." Geoise nodded with disdain and said, "You are right. Those so-called swordsmen in Marine are all half-baked and not worth mentioning at all." "So Uncle Geoise, are you mentioning this to me because the gift you mentioned is a knife?" "Yes, as a member of the Fegalando family, how can you not have a sword of your own?" "The knife on the wall." Geoise looked at Geoise with a look that made him hate the iron. He reprimanded, "Is this all you are good at? 21 skills are good, but as the heir of the family, using that kind of knife is simply embarrassing the family." Well, Geoise stopped talking. He glanced at Jalan's sword on his waist. According to Jalan's words, his sword must be one of the legendary supreme sharp knives. This is a masterpiece that is limited to 12 pieces in the world. Of course Geoise will not think that Geoise is planning to give away his knife. That is too nonsense. Since he said this, it means that the Fegalando family has more than one supreme sharp knife. With this kind of background, Geoise could only shout, "Good guy," in his heart, and at the same time, he was looking forward to it more and more. Geoise didn't let Geoise wait too long. He took Geoise to the end of the secret room, where there were several luxurious coffins. The coffin in the middle was the largest and the most gorgeously decorated. Corresponding photos are hung on the walls above all the coffins. It can be seen from the peculiar hairstyles of the colorful 8 gates that the people lying in these coffins must be the successive heads of the Fegalando family. After arriving here, Geoise first bowed to the coffins in front of him, and Geoise followed suit. Then, Galen walked to the largest coffin in the middle and slowly opened the coffin lid. Geoise walked to Geoise and looked into the coffin. He saw a skeleton wearing a golden armor lying inside. What made people complain was that there was hair on the skull and the photo was still there. The hairstyle above, the shelf life of this hair is simply heaven-defying. But soon Geoise's eyes were attracted by the knife held in the skeleton's arms. This knife has a jet black blade, the blade is covered with purple vein-like lines, and the bottom of the handle is inlaid with an extremely bright ruby. As he watched, Geoise's eyes became increasingly hollow, as if he had lost his soul. Galen was also looking at the knife in the coffin. He looked normal. He even touched the knife and said, "He is the first-generation head of the Fegalando family, Saint Cassius, who is also the owner of this knife. Speaking of which, you and him. Geoise, what's wrong with you?" Geoise finally noticed something strange about Geoise, and at this moment, something strange happened. Black flames suddenly burned on the knife he touched, and then the whole knife turned into a black light, passing through Saint Geoise and pouring into Geoise's right hand. The black light gradually condensed into the original shape of the knife, and Geoise finally came to his senses. He raised his right hand holding the knife with a blank look on his face and murmured, "What just happened? What happened to the knife?" Geoise was also shocked by the scene just now. He calmed down, took a deep look at Geoise, and said, "The sword in your hand is one of the 12 skills, and it's called Demon Sword Muramasa." As soon as the words, demon sword Muramasa, came out. The sword in Geoise's hand began to emit a black aura. A look of shock flashed across Geoise's eyes, because this kind of black energy was so familiar to him. This is the power of darkness. Geoise feels now the same as when he got the dark fruit in the Valley of the Gods. The demon sword Muramasa seems to be a part of his body. With a thought, Muramasa instantly turned into a black energy that merged with Geoise's right hand, and finally formed a black knife-shaped mark on the back of his hand. Geoise witnessed the whole process. His expression changed from the initial shock to the current calm. Looking at the mark on the back of Geoise's hand, he slowly said, "As expected, with the power of dark fruit, you are the most suitable master for Muramasa." Jalan's words sounded a bit mysterious. Geoise asked, "Does Uncle Jalan mean that anyone with dark fruit ability can become Muramasa's master?" "Of course not. To become the master of the demon sword Muramasa, you must first be of the Fegalando family's blood, otherwise you will be devoured by Muramasa." Swallow. Yes, Saint Ancestor Cassius 800 years ago was also a dark fruit-capable person, and his development of dark fruit has almost exceeded the limit. He can even actively separate the demonic power in his body. When Geoise heard the "beyond the boundaries" mentioned by Jalan just now, he thought it was fruit awakening. He even thought that the development level of this ancestor was a bit low and was just, almost surpassing. Doesn't that mean that he hadn't even awakened the fruit? Until the last sentence, Geoise directly denied this, because actively separating the power of demons sounded so outrageous that even he with the memory of Blue Star had never heard of it. This shows that the Esper has touched the original power of Devil Fruit, and it also shows that the awakening of the fruit is not the limit of Devil Fruit's power. There is a higher realm above this. The news he got from Jalan today completely overturned Geoise's understanding of the pirate world, and also made him put away his superiority with the memory of Blue Star. Think about it, the comics are never finished, and no one can guarantee that this world line will be exactly the same as in the comics. There are too many unknown factors. Geoise believes that he has developed dark fruit very well based on Blue Star's memory, but he is still far away from awakening, let alone transcending the boundaries. At this moment, his thirst for knowledge was very strong. Regarding Geoise, the heir of the family, Galen did not hide anything and continued to talk about that ancestor. 800 years ago, our ancestors used this demon sword Muramasa to give Joyboy a critical blow, but he himself was severely injured. He died of his injuries shortly after the establishment of the world government. Although he already knew the existence of Joyboy, Geoise still pretended to be curious and asked, "Uncle Jalan, who is the Joyboy you just talked about? Is he very strong?" "He is not even a match for strong men like our ancestors. Joyboy is the common enemy of all our celestial dragons. He is also the only one who has trained the power of Devil Fruit beyond its limits. He has mastered a terrifying power of rules, and because he combined his own power with Devil Fruit's, the power was completely integrated, and a Devil Fruit with both the characteristics of Paramesha and Zone was born, named Nika Fruit." As soon as the name of the Nika Fruit came out, the mark on Geoise's right hand suddenly flashed with black light, and the demon sword Murasaki Jingjung conveyed to him an emotion called unwillingness. He suppressed the restless Muramasa and asked in a deep voice, "So this Joey boy is dead, right?" Galen did not respond immediately this time. After a moment of silence, he slowly spoke. "According to secular terms, he must have died at the hands of the 20 kings of that year, but everyone knows that the Devil Fruit will be reborn after the person with abilities dies. As long as the Devil Fruit that contains his will is still alive, if he exists, then he has no real death." After saying that, Jalan looked at Geoise deeply and said, "Of course we will not let this fruit wander into the world. We have been looking for it for the past 800 years, but this fruit is just like your dark fruit. It seems to have its own will. Whenever we are about to find it, either it has been eaten, or it will suddenly disappear again. Fortunately, for such a long time, those who were lucky enough to obtain the Nika fruit could not use the power of this fruit at all, and there was not even a single person with the ability to awaken the fruit. So the world only knows that we are hiding it, the fabricated rubber fruit, without knowing the Nika fruit." After saying this in one breath, Jalan suddenly stretched out his hand and put it on Geoise's shoulder, and said sincerely, "But we still can't let down our guard. This world belongs to us, celestial dragons. Once someone fully activates the power of the Nika fruit, it will become our biggest threat. You should have heard a lot of rumors about it outside these years. Something about celestial dragons, right? Yeah, the world doesn't describe as celestial dragons very well. HMPH, you don't need to pay attention to what the ants said, but most of the celestial dragons nowadays are really just greedy for pleasure. Their long-term pampered life has corroded their minds. There is only one king left in the past. Once the Nika fruit comes out, it's hard for me to imagine how we can resist now that the power has revived. Geoise nodded in agreement, thinking that if it weren't for Geoise and the few awakening factions among the celestial dragons, there would be no need to wait for the Nika fruit to awaken. Just one Rock's pirate might be destroyed by the celestial dragons. Galen sighed and said, actually, in addition to the Nika fruit, the dark fruit is also the focus of our search. Its power definitely played a vital role in the battle 800 years ago, but after all, the ancestors have not really reached the level of Joyboy. So in order to prevent dark fruit from becoming difficult to deal with in the hands of others, before he died, he separated part of dark fruit's demonic power and injected it into demon sword Muramasa. This demon sword has accompanied our ancestors in battles for several years. Our ancestors often nourished it with their own blood, so dark fruit will leave the Fegalando family, but it will never. It will always belong to our family. Quote, as a user with dark fruit ability, with its help, things like fruit awakening will become much easier for you. I don't know the details. You need to experience this yourself. It turns out that our ancestors' ideas back then were far-sighted. A powerful devil fruit like dark fruit is really hard to find. If it weren't for that idiot Rox, we don't know how long it would take to see it again. Now it has finally returned to our Fegalando family again. I believe this is God's arrangement. Jalen's words gave Geoise a feeling of being the chosen one, but he didn't know if his luck could surpass the future Luffy. He has even considered killing Luffy in advance, but now that Luffy is not born yet, if he wants to take action, he can only go to Luffy's father Long. According to the original development of the world line, Long will definitely be brought into Marine by Garp, and then he can look for opportunities. Geoise definitely can't take action as soon as he sees the dragon. After all, there is Garp in Marine. He must have a reason to make everyone speechless. Of course, the reason is very easy to find. That guy Long is a fool, and sooner or later Marine will be judged. By then, wouldn't it be more reasonable for him to, accidentally, kill a Marine traitor? Geoise was silently calculating in his mind. Jeline thought he was worried about the future and said, Geoise, the probability of the Nika fruit awakening is still very small, so you don't have to worry too much about it. What you have to do now is to increase your power and bring the Fegalando family's status in Mariajoy to a higher level. Quote. Geoise was startled. The meaning of these words sounded a bit wrong. She couldn't help but ask. Going to the next level. Isn't the Fegalando family prominent enough? Of course it's prominent, but it's just not enough. When 20 kings besieged Joyboy, our ancestors contributed the most. If he hadn't died too early, how could it be that the Nerona family would be the leader of Mariajoy now? It should be our Fegalando family sitting on the throne of heaven. After hearing this, Geoise said in her heart, what a good guy. His uncle is also a young man who wants to usurp the throne. After Galen finished speaking, he regretted a little. He looked around and said in a low voice, just remember what I said, and don't mention it again after you go out. I am Shang's ability is weird and unpredictable, and there is no guarantee that he will hear it. Geoise nodded. Now he can't even deal with Gulanduo, let alone the ultimate boss I am. Galen patted Geoise on the shoulder and said, okay, if there's anything else you like in the secret room, take it away. I'll have to see how strong you are after we get out. The Black Bible condensed from Geoise's hands, and he asked honestly. Uncle Jeline, can I take them all away? Quote. If Geoise hadn't been his nephew, Jeline would have drawn his sword. He took a deep breath, glared at Geoise and said. You're not the head of the family yet. Why are you taking them all away? Do you have the ability to hold on to this inheritance? Well, I just want to mention that you are a bit stingy, Uncle Jeline. Jeline snorted coldly and said, sooner or later, everything here will be yours. The layout should be bigger. All right, Geoise reluctantly agreed, thought for a while and asked, has Lucia eaten devil fruit? You want to get a devil fruit for her, right? Don't worry, I have already given her a good fruit. Otherwise, do you think she, a slave, can get the position of captain of the guard so quickly? Quote. Really? Then thank you, Uncle Geline. No need. She is indeed loyal to you. It doesn't matter if you give her a fruit. Besides, if she dies in the guard team, you will go crazy when you come back, right? Then I have to give her something else. I think she is a swordsman. Aren't there 4 famous swords hanging outside? Let me pick one and give it to her. Well, just watch and come. Geoise didn't just think about Lucia, he also didn't forget Ginny, but he was not going to give the devil fruit here to Ginny, because he had already thought of a devil fruit that was most suitable for Ginny. He wanted to give Ginny something else, like a gun. Uncle Geline, does your family have a better gun? Gun? What do you want this for? Our family all uses swords, so there's no need for it. I want to give it away. I have a friend who uses guns. A good gun will improve her a lot. Are the friends you speak of the 3 from the Valley of Gods back then? Well, that's the girl with pink hair, her name is Ginny. Haha, I see, let's do this. I will instruct the science class to build a suitable gun. I don't think you will choose to stay in the family now, right? I will send it directly to Marine then. Geoise nodded. He would definitely not stay with Gulanduo around. Only when he becomes strong enough will he truly return to the family, kill Gulanduo, and take back everything that belongs to him. But the development of the gun will have to wait for a while, and Geoise doesn't want to go back empty-handed. After all, he told Ginny that he would bring a gift back. He thought about what he had said about giving Ginny a pair of boots, so he stretched out his hand to Guon and said, Uncle Geline, there are always boots in the family, right? I want the kind that girls wear, the most expensive and beautiful ones. Of course there is, but you have to give it to that Ginny. Just looking good is of no use. Not long ago, a guy named Judge in the science class developed some combat boots. There are women's models in them. You can take them away later. Quote. That's great, thank you very much, Uncle Galen. HMPH, 2 women showed up in a short while. You better not spend all your energy on them, otherwise I will have to help you get rid of these distracting thoughts with my own hands. No, I know what I should do. Uncle Geline, don't worry. It better be this way. After saying that, Geline and Geoise bowed to the coffin here again, and then the 2 of them walked outside together. When they came to the seastone door, Geoise subconsciously slowed down. The feeling of weakness was too uncomfortable. Galen glanced at him and said calmly, Why are you lingering any longer? Do you still need me to support you? Geoise didn't mean to show off, and nodded very bachelorly. Galen suddenly laughed and said, Then you think too much. I won't support you anymore, and you don't need it. Ah, Uncle Geline, are you? Before Geoise finished speaking, Geline suddenly reached out and pressed his hand on Geoise's back. Before he could react, he was pushed out with a strong force. Jalen's strength was controlled very skillfully. Although Geoise was suddenly pushed out, his body was able to quickly regain his balance and finally stood firmly in front of the seastone gate. Geoise's hand was still pressed on the door. He rolled his eyes, ready to face that feeling of weakness. However, after a long time, Geoise was surprised to find that he didn't feel anything special. He also tried to activate his ability. The hand pressing on the door turned dark and the ability was activated smoothly. Galen stood not far away with his arms folded and joked. How's it going? Do you still need me to help you? Chapter 51. Geoise stood there stunned for a while. He raised his hands hesitantly and clenched his fists hard. Not only did he not feel any powerlessness, but he felt that the dark power in his body was much stronger than before. Looking at Geoise, who stood there in a daze for a long time, Geline shook his head and chuckled, stepped forward and said, How do you feel? Are you satisfied with your current situation? Geoise nodded, and then shook his right hand. The knife-shaped mark on the back of his hand squirmed, and several black streams poured out along the fingers and gathered in the palm of his hand, gradually taking on the shape of a knife. The arm shook, and the originally liquid darkness suddenly solidified, and the demon sword Muramasa, shining with black light, appeared in Geoise's hand. Holding Muramasa in his hands, Geoise felt that the dark power in his body was pouring out continuously. If it weren't for the treasures in the secret room, he would really want to release it completely. Geoise probably guessed why he was not affected by Seastone. He looked at the demon sword Muramasa in his hand and said, Uncle Geline, is it because of this knife? That's right, demon sword Muramasa can not only enhance dark fruit's power, it can also cover up the devil fruit's aura on you. You no longer have to worry about the sea or Seastone in the future. Hearing this, a smile appeared on Geoise's face. When he and Galen walked out of the door, he turned towards the door and released universal pull. Under the pull of gravity, the two Seastone doors quickly closed together with a loud sound, ring. Galen took out the key and locked the door, and then the two of them left. Outside the palace, Lucia had dismissed all the golden armored guards and stayed here alone to wait. When Geoise and Geline appeared from the door of the palace, Lucia's fiery eyes instantly locked Geoise firmly. Geoise waved to Lucia, and Lucia flashed directly to Geoise and called her young master gently. Lucia's voice was as moving as her person. Geoise gently held her hand. She flashed her big amber eyes and said with twinkling eyes, Young master, I am just your slave. This is too intimate. Saying this, Lucia showed no sign of struggling, and even moved closer to Geoise. Stop being a slave. You know, I have never treated you as a slave. Geoise summoned the dark Bible and took out a long knife. Lucia looked at the knife in Geoise's hand curiously. The blade was sealed in a beautifully shaped scabbard. The blade was in the shape of a golden petal, and the bright red handle was wrapped with dark golden lines. Even though it hasn't been taken out of the sheath, the vague edge emanating from it already shows how extraordinary this knife is. Lucia asked, Young master, is this the gift that Lord Geline gave you? Geoise shook his head and said, No, this is the gift I chose for you. Its name is Falling Light. This is for me. Lucia's eyes widened in surprise. After coming back to her senses, she waved her hands and said, Young master, this is too precious, I really don't deserve it. Seeing that Lucia refused to accept it, Geoise looked serious and said fiercely, Is it worthy or not? If not, don't follow me anymore. Hearing this, Lucia lost her temper. She knew that Geoise was probably pretending, but she didn't want to bet on this probability. Taking the zuiming from Geoise very obediently, Lucia said softly, Thank you, young master. That's right, it's just 21 jobs, just accept it with confidence. Geoise performed a Sichuan opera face changing, and imitated Geline to pretend. Lucia's eyes narrowed into a crescent shape, and she felt sweet in her heart. Geline rolled his eyes obscurely, thinking that you took the things I gave you and pretended to give them away. This is really intolerable. Seeing Geoise still talking to Lucia, Geline glanced at Geoise and said indifferently, Geoise, have you forgotten what I just said to you in there? Geoise asked casually without turning his head, What did Uncle Geline mean? You kid. I said I would see your strength after you get out. Now, you and Lucia, come with me to the training room. Geline gave the order in an unquestionable tone, then turned and left. Geoise sighed helplessly and pulled Lucia to chase after him. It was called a training room, but when Geoise arrived, he realized that this so-called training room was even larger than the training ground of Marine School. The walls and floors of the room were covered with dense sword marks. After coming in, Garen said directly, Okay, you and Lucia go fight, let me see the results of your training in Marine. If I am not satisfied, you can practice here until I am satisfied. By the way, you are not allowed to use the fruit ability. Without waiting for Geoise to respond, Lucia said with embarrassment, But I don't want to attack the young master. Lucia's words can be said to be disrespectful. Garen's face showed a trace of displeasure, and he said lightly, You are very courageous. You dare to disobey me. What, are you afraid of hurting Geoise? No, the young master is definitely stronger than me, Okay Lucia, let's go fight, don't worry, I'm much stronger than you think. Geoise waved his hand to interrupt Lucia's words. He had noticed that Garen began to lose patience. He had no doubt that if he hadn't been around, Garen would have killed Lucia directly. On weekdays, Garen is completely different from the way he is with Geoise. After all, he is a celestial dragon who regards all living beings as ants. Garen only shows his easygoing side when dealing with his own people, especially his nephew Geoise. To others, he is always the head of the Fegalando family who is high above and indifferent to everything. So Geoise saved Lucia's life. The two walked to the center of the training room. Lucia pulled out the Zuoming that Geoise had just given her. A sharp cold light flashed across the black blade. Geoise summoned the demon sword Muramasa. He smiled at Lucia opposite him and said, "Lucia, I heard from Uncle Garen that you are also a demon fruit power. Let me see your ability first." Lucia naturally obeyed Geoise's words and nodded immediately after hearing the words. Then she closed her eyes. In Geoise's surprised eyes, a deep purple flame suddenly burned on her body. Then, a pair of pitch-black wings spread out from behind Lucia. The golden armor she was wearing gradually turned into the same color as the flame under the calcination of the purple flame, and circles of black patterns emerged. Seeing Lucia's changes, Geoise couldn't help but look at Galen and admired. "Zone's devil fruit. It looks like a phantom beast. Uncle Geline is really generous. Thank you." Galen folded his arms and said nothing, but there was an imperceptible smile on the corner of his mouth, which showed that he was quite happy with Geoise's praise. If Geoise knew Galen's inner thoughts, he would probably suspect that he was deliberately showing off in front of his nephew. At this time, Lucia had completely released the fruit's ability. When she opened her eyes, she could see that her amber pupils had also turned into deep purple, with a strange light flowing through them. Under the influence of the fruit's ability, her face became extremely mature and beautiful, and her figure became plumper. When she looked at Geoise, Geoise suddenly felt a restlessness and a burning sensation in her body. Geoise definitely didn't have any evil intentions. This strangeness is most likely related to Lucia's fruit ability. Facing Geoise, Lucia had no intention of being on guard at all. She lightly opened her red lips and made a charming voice. "Young master, my fruit is the Zone Phantom Beast species, in the form of a fallen angel, and my ability is. Needless to say, I've probably guessed a little bit. Let's get started, let me feel it." "As you wish, young master." As soon as she finished speaking, the black wings behind Lucia shook, and her whole body turned into a black stream of light and rushed towards Geoise, scattering pieces of black feathers along the way. Clang! Zuoming and Muramasa collided together, making a sound of fighting. Lucia in the fallen angel form has been greatly blessed in terms of speed and strength. Geoise can tell from this blow that Lucia is definitely stronger than the #1 female student in Marine today. Guon is much better. However, Lucia was even more surprised at this time, because Geoise's strength indeed far exceeded her expectations. Although she did not use her full strength in this attack, she even used her fruit ability after all, but Geoise blocked it so easily. She stared blankly at Geoise's young face, and 2 lines of clear tears suddenly flowed from her beautiful eyes. Geoise was stunned. He thought he hadn't fought back yet. Why was Lucia crying? He didn't care about fighting anymore. He used some force to push Zuoming away, put his arms around Lucia's waist and pulled her into his arms, and asked softly, "What's wrong with you, Lucia?" Lucia's nose moved and she choked. "Young master, you must have suffered a lot outside these years. How could you have such strength just by practicing in Marine school?" Well, Geoise tried hard to recall his experiences over the years. Except for those days in the Valley of Gods, he seemed to have suffered very little in the rest of the time. So he said a little bit dumbfounded, "Lucia, you are overthinking. My life outside is not as bad as you think. In fact, my life is quite easy. As for strength, can't it be your young master that I have extraordinary talents?" Lucia wiped the tears on her face and was about to speak when Galen, who had been watching the battle, suddenly shouted, "What are you doing there? Geoise, you want me to test your strength in person, right?" Hearing this, Lucia jumped out of Geoise's arms and said hurriedly, "Young master, let's continue the battle just now." As for Garen, an uncle who unleashed conquerors on his nephew as soon as they met, Lucia didn't think that Garen would be so gentle when he started to attack Geoise. If he injured her young master Geoise, it would be even worse than killing her. Geoise, on the other hand, looked nonchalant, thinking that if the worst happened, he would just keep driving the Kamui and let Geline chop it. Anyway, it wasn't the first time they met like this, so he didn't need to argue at all. He even wanted to appreciate the way Garen was helpless against him. However, seeing how flustered Lucia was, Geoise gave up on this naughty idea and prepared to end this reluctant battle quickly. Thinking of this, he raised his knee towards Lucia, and then kicked out a slash wave entwined with lightning. Tempest kick Reikiri. Lucia's eyes narrowed slightly, and her armor instantly wrapped around the pendant in her hands. She held the knife across her chest with both hands. The slash wave fell on her sword edge and did not dissipate. The strong force pushed her towards the back. A thin layer of cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and she sighed in her heart at the strength of Geoise's attack. If she hadn't entered the fallen angel form in advance, this slash wave would have been enough to determine the outcome with one hit. It can only be said that Geoise still underestimated Lucia's strength. She pursed her lips and smiled, and purple flames rose from her body. A flush appeared on Lucia's face, her strength increased again, and with a swipe of her sword, she directly dispersed the slash wave. When she looked at Geoise again, an unusually charming smile appeared on her face. "Young master, you are really amazing, I like you the most." Geoise was immediately confused by Lucia's sudden confession. He couldn't help but ask, "Lucia, are you okay?" Lucia pursed her lips and smiled, a burst of purple arrogance slowly spit out from her mouth, and said, "What can I do, young master? I just used the fruit ability. This purple flame is called the flame of desire. It can make others turn into ashes in the burning of their own desires, but if it is used on myself, it will be fine. Amplify the strongest desires within me, thus greatly increasing my power." "So your desire is..." "Yes, my desire is you, young master." Lucia's voice at this time had a soul-stirring charm. The restlessness in Geoise's heart became more intense, and the burning feeling became stronger and stronger. He suppressed the restlessness in his heart and decided not to hold back. He wasn't afraid that he couldn't control it, but he was afraid that Lucia would say something sarcastic later. As long as they were there, it would be fine, mainly because Guon was still standing there. A flash appeared in front of Lucia. He turned the demon sword Muramasa over and slapped Lucia's abdomen like a board. Lucia had no intention of blocking. She directly spread her arms and hugged her. Written by Geoise. "What?" Geoise hurriedly stopped her hand, and without enough time to break, she plunged directly into Lucia's broad chest. Lucia smiled sweetly. She picked up the somewhat confused Geoise, lowered her head and kissed him. The pair of black wings slowly folded in, covering her and Geoise. The corner of Galen's mouth twitched when he saw this scene. He wanted to yell out, but in the end he just sighed and said, "I shouldn't have let these two people fight." On the way out of the training room, Geline walked in front with a dark face, and Lucia followed Geoise with a red face. Only Geoise's face was normal, and he was recalling the scene in the training room. Wrapped in countless soft black feathers, Lucia kissed him affectionately, and he kept his eyes open the whole time until Lucia released the fruit ability. The fire of desire burned out. Lucia slowly opened her eyes, and then saw Geoise staring at her without blinking. Then Lucia fainted in Geoise's arms, and Geoise took a lot of effort to wake her up. Geline didn't plan to let the two fight anymore. He saw that the two would never fight in their lifetime. At this moment, he was filled with dog food and walked in front without saying a word. Geoise glanced at Lucia, who was hanging her head beside him, and teased, "Lucia, your fruit ability really surprised me." "Well, master, please don't laugh at me anymore, I. A wisp of steam came out of Lucia's head. Although she still refused to look up, Geoise could see her ears that were already red. Geoise did not intend to let Lucia go, and continued, "But I want to hear it again. Who did you say you liked the most?" Lucia almost buried her head in her chest. She hummed a few times, and finally, under Geoise's coercion, she made a sound as thin as a mosquito's hum, "I like the master the most." Hearing this, Geoise suddenly felt refreshed and nodded with satisfaction. Enough. Galen could no longer bear it. He turned around and roared, but Geoise was not afraid of him at all, and Lucia was frightened and suddenly got into Geoise's arms again. Galen silently put his hand on the handle of the knife at his waist. He wanted to enforce the family law. Geoise was completely unaware, and even hugged Lucia in his arms a little tighter. "Bulu Bulu." The voice of the Den Den Mushi sounded, and Geline frowned slightly, and took out a Den Den Mushi with a white beard from his arms. There was a scar on the left eye of the Den Den Mushi, and his expression looked very serious. After Guon answered the call, Den Mushi made an old voice. Saint Garen, come to the meeting room. There is something that needs to be arbitrated by you, the leader of the Knights of God. What is it? Speak clearly, I am with my nephew. The serious coffin face of Den Mushi suddenly showed a surprised expression and said, Nephew. You mean Geoise? He was brought back by you. Yes, he is back. Tell me what it is first. Okay, do you still remember the Honagu of Don Quixote family? Oh, that complete idiot. I remember that he sent a message some time ago that he wanted to return to Mariajoy. Yes, but he is dead. Dead. A cold light flashed in Garen's eyes, and he lightly raised his thumb, unsheathed the sharp blade at his waist, and said coldly, How did he die? Who killed him? Humph, although he deserved it, celestial still flows in his body. Dragon's blood, you must get my permission to kill him. Den Mushi was silent for a while, then slowly said, It's his biological son, Doflamingo. Garen's face froze, he suddenly looked up at Geoise, and then fell silent. Geoise spread his hands and cursed secretly in his heart. What are you looking at me doing? I haven't even started yet, but your record is already available for inspection. When I called the other side and saw that there was no reply from Galen, I continued. Doflamingo has just returned with the head of the famous saint Huogu. He wants to express his attitude and return to our celestial dragons. This matter is a bit troublesome. I have summoned people from other families and I am waiting for you to come over now. Discussed together. I see. Jeline hung up the phone and Geoise asked. Uncle Jeline, who called just now? Satan Saint, you should have met him. He also went to the Valley of the Gods back then. He is one of the 5 elders. Now he is mainly responsible for the science class. He has a good relationship with our family. Then you have to go to his place now and take me with you. I'm quite interested in this Doflamingo. I think his behavior is to your liking. Geoise smiled and said. Is there a reason why I can go? Okay, you have almost never appeared in Mariajoy. This time is just for you to get acquainted with me. You should go change your clothes first. Change. Geoise's mind immediately thought of the spacesuits worn by celestial dragons, and he said with a look of disgust. Forget it. Those clothes are fat and ugly. I don't like them. Jalen's face darkened and he said. What nonsense are you talking about? We must wear the formal attire of our clan on this occasion. This is a symbol of status. It is Lucia's duty to help you change. Let her take you there. After saying that, Galen turned away and went to change clothes. Lucia said softly, Young master, I think the family's formal attire looks very nice. Come on, I'll take you to change. Geoise sighed helplessly, waved his hand, and followed Lucia back to his original dormitory. Nearly 7 years have passed since Geoise last left here, but the furnishings in the palace are still clean and tidy, especially his room, which can be described as spotless. Lucia opened the wardrobe next to the bed, and there was a long black windbreaker of the same style hanging in it from childhood to adulthood. She took out a few pieces that roughly fit Geoise's figure and put them on the bed, and said softly. When the young master is away, I will declare a few new ones for you every year. I am afraid that one day you will come back and you will not be able to find formal clothes that suit you. Geoise looked at Lucia blankly. She seemed to always be able to touch the deepest softness in her heart unintentionally. Lucia stepped forward and gently untied Geoise's shirt and said softly. I still remember that when I was a child, I used to change the young master's clothes in this way. Maybe my skills are a bit rusty now. I hope you won't blame me, young master. Lucia, have you been cleaning my bedroom all these years? Yes, this is my duty. Although there is no shortage of places to live here, I think the young master would still like to live here, right? Lucia neatly folded the unbuttoned coats and placed them on the bed. Then she picked up a black windbreaker and put it on Geoise, and then began to fasten the buttons on the clothes. Geoise looked down at Lucia, who looked serious, and suddenly said. Lucia, if I let you stay with me, will you feel like you've lost your freedom? Lucia was stunned for a moment. She raised her head and stared into Geoise's eyes. Then she slowly pressed her face against Geoise's chest and murmured in a low voice. How could it be possible? Master, this is my wish. Lucia fastened the last button on Geoise. She took a few steps back, looked at it carefully from top to bottom, and praised. Young master, you look really good in this dress. Geoise put on a pair of black boots and walked to the floor-length mirror. In the mirror, he was dressed in black and had a tall and slender figure. Lucia walked behind Geoise and stretched out her arms around Geoise's waist. Geoise naturally put her hand on Lucia's hand. The two of them had a moment of tenderness and then went out. After all, they had business to do later. When he saw Guon again, he was also wearing a black suit of the same style as Geoise, and was followed by a burly, golden-armored guard wearing a helmet. The golden-armored guard saluted Geoise and said respectfully, "Lord Ji Geshong, I am Carlos, the captain of the first escort team. By the way, the Fegolando family has a total of 5 escort teams, of which the first, third, and fifth teams are under the control of Guon, while the second and fourth teams are assigned to Gulando by him. The third team has been handed over to Geoise by Guon, and of course he does not need to hand it over. After all, the captain of the third team is Lucia, and it is a natural thing for Geoise to take over the third team." Geoise looked at Geoise, who had changed his clothes, with a look of approval in his eyes, and said, "Yes, this is like a member of our Fegolando family." Geoise put one hand in his pocket and said, "I thought it was a fat sack with a fish tank on its head." "Don't talk nonsense, you don't need to bring any fish or hood here, and I think that kind of clothes, daughter okay." "Uncle Geoise, you hesitated just now, didn't you? Speaking of which, I've never seen you wear that kind of clothes. Does it not fit you?" Galen glared and said, "You're lucky to be my nephew. Even in Mariajoy, there aren't many people who dare to talk to me like that." Geoise couldn't scare Geoise anymore. He laughed and said, "But who makes me your nephew? Uncle Geoise, just accept it." After saying that, Geoise walked forward on his own, and Lucia hurriedly trotted to follow. "Young master, do you know the way?" Looking at Geoise's back, Jalan's sullen face gradually relaxed. He suddenly shook his head and chuckled a few times, saying, "This feels pretty good." Carlos, the captain of the first team, glanced at Guon secretly and was shocked. Saint Guon, who had always been unsmiling and awe-inspiring, actually had such a side. Galen put his hands behind his back, looking a little old-fashioned. In fact, he was still in his prime. He seemed to suddenly remember something, until Geoise's back almost disappeared from his sight. He sighed softly and murmured, "It would be better if that boy could be by my side." In the Tianlong conference hall, a dozen celestial dragons wearing similar spacesuits sat around a rectangular conference table, all looking at the little boy standing at the end of the table. The boy has short yellow hair and wears oval-shaped sunglasses on his face. He looks young and is just taller than the table. He was wearing a washed white shirt, with some bloodline remaining on it that could not be washed away. Amid the scornful or mocking gazes of the celestial dragons, he stood there alone, holding a bloody human head in his hand. Saint Satan's face was expressionless. He folded his hands on the table and said nothing. The boy's hand holding the head was trembling slightly. He raised his head and said in a hoarse voice, "Will you let me come back or not? Haven't I done enough?" No one paid attention to the boy. The group of celestial dragons had lost interest in him and were all showing off what kind of slave they had bought today. Just when the boy was about to collapse, Saint Satan slowly spoke. "Doflamingo, you'd better be patient. Your matter cannot be finalized until Saint Guon arrives." "Why?" "Because you killed the celestial dragons. If he finds you guilty later, not only will you not be able to return to Mariajoy, you will also be executed on the spot." As soon as these words came out, Doflamingo felt a chill in his heart. He already regretted coming back here. It was really uncomfortable to feel like his destiny was being controlled by others. Every minute and every second that passed here made him feel extremely tortured. Suddenly, a burst of unhurried footsteps sounded from the door of the chamber, and then the door was pushed open. What appeared in Doflamingo's eyes was a burly man wearing gold armor. Doflamingo swallowed. When he was still in the Holy Land, he often heard the name of Saint Geoise from the famous Saint Huogu, but he had never met Saint Geoise himself. So at first he thought it was Geoise Sheng who pushed the door open, but the burly man immediately stood upright by the door as if waiting for something. The originally noisy celestial dragons fell silent instantly, and several female celestial dragons stretched their necks to look towards the door. Tread. Under everyone's gaze, two slender figures entered the meeting hall. it was Geoise and Geoise, the uncle and nephew. Of course it was Carlos who opened the door just now. After Galen and Geoise came in, he stepped out of his own accord. Lucia didn't come in directly. She was waiting outside the door. The celestial dragons in the hall were stunned when they saw Geoise next to Geoise, and they all began to guess Geoise's identity. Without saying a word, Geoise took Geoise and sat down in the two empty seats on the lower left side of Sardin. Sardin's eyes stayed on Geoise for a while, then he looked at Galen and said, "Sheng Geoise, you are finally here. Do you need to introduce the person next to you first?" Galen crossed his arms, glanced at Geoise next to him, and said, "He is my nephew, Saint Fegolando Geoise." Geoise also crossed his arms. After Galen's brief introduction, he just nodded slightly. The behavior of the uncle and nephew was extremely casual, but it caused an uproar among the people. After a brief shock, a group of celestial dragons immediately began to whisper. "Saint Garen's nephew. Isn't that the sole heir of the Fegolando family? Oh my god, I almost forgot that he has a nephew. I didn't expect to see him today. Sage Geoise is very young and looks very similar to Saint Geoise, but his hairstyle is a bit too ordinary. Let's go and get to know him first. He will probably be the next leader." Several celestial dragons had already moved chairs to Geoise's side and were talking to Geoise enthusiastically. Doflamingo was completely left there. He stared blankly at Geoise, who was surrounded by celestial dragons, and a strong sense of jealousy emerged in his heart. The celestial dragons, who have always been arrogant, actually showed their intention to please Geoise, and all this stems from Geoise's identity as the sole heir of the Fegolando family. This identity is really too dazzling. To most people outside, celestial dragons are all the same. As long as they are celestial dragons, they are superior and cannot be disobeyed. But in Mariajoy, the home base of the celestial dragons, the Fegolando family is definitely a special existence. It is synonymous with power, and without taking action, the Fegolando family is the last barrier to defend the glory of the celestial dragons. The treatment Geoise was receiving now was also what Geoise had enjoyed before, and he watched quietly. Until a look of impatience appeared on Geoise's face, he tapped a finger on the table and said in a deep voice, "Silence, it's time to talk about Doflamingo." A faint kingly pressure emanated from Garen. Except for Sardin, the rest of the celestial dragons were stagnant in breathing. They smiled awkwardly, and then returned to their seats silently. Sardin didn't say a word during the whole process. In fact, he and Galen were no higher or lower in terms of status. It's just that today was the first time that Galen let Geoise appear in public. He wisely lowered his sense of existence. Even he has tacitly defined the nature of this meeting as Geoise's public meeting, and he is very happy to sell the Fegolando family's face. As for Doflamingo, from the moment Geoise's identity was revealed by Galen, he was completely reduced to nothing. How can a traitor's son compare with Geoise, the heir to the Fegolando family? If Galen hadn't brought the topic back to Doflamingo, no one would have even looked at Doflamingo again until the end of the meeting. Doflamingo also felt that everyone was ignoring him, but no matter how angry he was, he could only grit his teeth and wait for Galen's final judgment on him. And his life or death may depend on Galen's light words. Jealousy, fear, unwillingness, all kinds of emotions were intertwined in Doflamingo's heart. He already wanted to leave here, but that would mean that he had completely given up the only chance to regain his identity as a celestial dragon, and he couldn't bear it. Galen's eyes were cold, and he could feel Doflamingo's negative emotions because of his strong sense of knowledge. He glanced at the Honogu head and said, "How does it feel to kill your own biological father with your own hands?" Doflamingo's body shook violently. This sentence was like opening up his scars. He gripped Honogu's hair tightly and squeezed out a sentence through his teeth. "It doesn't feel like anything. He deserves to die. Give me a reason." Doflamingo finally couldn't hold it any longer. He was only a 10-year-old child after all. Under Galen's questioning, his emotions finally exploded. "He's so stupid. He killed my mother. And he let my brother and I live like that." Doflamingo told everything he had experienced outside the Holy Land. At the end of the story, he threw Honogu's head out like trash. The head rolled on the ground and did not stop until it hit the table leg. The remaining affection between father and son in Doflamingo's heart turned into hatred at this moment. He looked at the celestial dragons who were sitting on their chairs and looking at him like clowns, and shouted in his heart. I was supposed to be one of them. My life is ruined. After hearing this, Geoise just sneered, without even looking at the human head that fell on the ground, and said lightly. Sure enough, he brought it upon himself. This kind of fate is natural for him. Sardin said from the side. Saint Galen, what do you think of Doflamingo's return to the Holy Land? Galen pondered for a moment, and first glanced at a celestial dragon sitting diagonally across the corner. This celestial dragon has green hair and an ugly face. Of course, apart from Geoise and Geoise, almost none of the celestial dragons present are good-looking, so his face is not outstanding here. Saint Muscarad, Doflamingo is a member of your Don Quixote family. Do you want him to come back? Geoise raised his eyebrows when he heard the name. He still has some impression of this celestial dragons. Isn't it the guy who beat up another celestial dragons in Mariajoy to save Shirahoshi and was finally executed by Garen? But now this guy has not been brainwashed by Otahime, and his personality is no different from other celestial dragons. After hearing this, Muscarad looked at Doflamingo with disdain and said. Huo Mingu is the sinner who brought shame to the Don Quixote family. Our family has expelled him. He and his family will never want to return to the family again in this life. Doflamingo felt as if he was struck by lightning. He stared at Muscarad and clenched his fists. However, Muscarad turned his head and looked at Galen with a smile on his face and said. Of course, it's up to you, Lord Geoise, to decide how to deal with him. If you want him to come back, that's not. Okay, I get it. Geoise waved his hand to interrupt. Under Doflamingo's uneasy gaze, he suddenly turned to look at Geoise and said. Geoise, it's up to you to decide whether Doflamingo will stay or die. As soon as these words came out, everyone was shocked and focused their attention on Geoise. Geoise had a look of surprise on his face. He didn't expect that Geoise would hand over the decision-making power on this matter to him. Sardin, who had been silent all this time, glanced at Galen and already understood Galen's intention. Galen is building momentum for Geoise, letting other celestial dragons see the importance he attaches to Geoise, and thus wants to completely consolidate the status of the heir to the Geoise family and allow him to gain a firm foothold in Mariajoy. When Sardin turned his attention to Geoise with his arms folded, his expression suddenly changed. He noticed the black knife-shaped mark on the back of Geoise's hand. His eyes flashed, and he was surprised. Is that the demon sword Muramasa? Saint Garen has already given it to Geoise. Thinking of this, Sardin, who originally wanted to express his opinion, shut up completely. He had already made up his mind. No matter what decision Geoise made later, he would have to support Doflamingo even if he really wanted to come back. Because the demon sword Muramasa is not only a symbol of the head of the Fegalando family, its birth is of extremely important significance to the entire Celestial Dragons group. That is a knife that can kill gods. Of course, the god does not refer to the celestial dragons who claim to be gods, but the Nika who will awaken again who knows when. Geoise thought for a moment, looked up at Doflamingo, and said. To be honest, I quite admire you, Doflamingo. Originally, when he heard that Jia Linsheng had handed over the decision-making power to Geoise, Doflamingo thought that he was completely out of luck. After all, Geoise looked too young. In Doflamingo's opinion, Galen's behavior was that he didn't take himself seriously at all, and his attitude was as casual as handling a piece of garbage. He didn't expect Geoise to speak for him. Not giving him the death penalty was the best result. But now when he heard Geoise actually say that he admired him, the fire of hope in Doflamingo's heart was ignited again. He looked at Geoise with hope. At this moment, his fate was completely in Geoise's hands. However, Geoise was not in a hurry to make the final decision. He just asked. You have a younger brother, right? Why didn't he come here with you? Doflamingo was stunned for a moment, then nodded and said. Yes, his name is Rocinante. He was stimulated and ran away somewhere. Oh, so you are the only one left in your family now. If you are allowed to come back, are you sure you can stay in the family? Doflamingo couldn't help but look at Muscarad, and the only response he received was a look of disdain. He fell silent, and Muscarad's attitude represented the Don Quixote family's attitude towards him. Geoise was right. Even if he was allowed to return to the family, as a traitorous son, he might not even be able to find a place to stay. Among the people in the entire hall, the only one who showed concern for him was Geoise. In fact, regardless of how cruel Doflamingo turned out to be, he is still just a 10-year-old kid now, so it would be good if he didn't collapse in the face of such heavy pressure. Now may be the most vulnerable time in his life. Even though Geoise didn't mean to care about him when he asked this, it made Doflamingo feel a little warmth in his cold heart. Coupled with Geoise's unattainable status for him, this care is even more valuable. So when he spoke again, his title for Geoise also changed. Lord Geoise, what do you think I should do? Geoise smiled slightly and said, "We, the Fegolando family, can accept you." Nani. Before Doflamingo could react, a burst of exclamations broke out in the conference hall. Jeline also glanced at Geoise in surprise, but didn't say much. Muscard looked at Geoise in disbelief and said, "Sage Geoise, are you kidding me? He is the son of a traitor." Geoise frowned, a wisp of black air floated out of the corner of his eyes, and said coldly, "What, are you questioning my decision?" Buzz. Jet black conquerors emanated from Geoise, and the lights in the conference hall gradually dimmed instantly. Of course, Geoise has suppressed conquerors' strength to the limit. After all, these celestial dragons are too weak. But even so, under the influence of his conquerors, many celestial dragons still felt dizzy, especially Muscard. His body swayed, and finally fell down from the chair and sat down, on the ground. He had no idea what was happening and looked at Geoise with a horrified look on his face. The other celestial dragons were also frightened like geese and sat on their chairs, not daring to move. Satan was not surprised by the conquerors displayed by Geoise. It would be a huge surprise if the sole heir of the Fegolando family did not even have this qualification. Doflamingo had awakened conquerors before due to an accident, but he was too young to know what conquerors was, let alone control it. Unaffected, all he saw was the scene where the celestial dragons were so frightened that they didn't even dare to fart after Geoise finished speaking. But what shocked him the most was what Geoise said. He is still wondering if he heard it wrong. That's the Fegolando family. Doflamingo still remembers that when Honagu decided to leave the family, he said that he was most worried about the Fegolando family. Because the successive heads of this family have a privilege that is feared by all celestial dragons, that is, they can judge celestial dragons. Doflamingo never dreamed that he would have the opportunity to join this family one day. This was so dreamy that he even stuttered when he spoke. Lord J, are you serious? Geoise's face darkened. It was okay for Doflamingo to stutter, but he stuttered on the first word of his name. Fortunately, no one here understood the meaning of GG. He frowned and said impatiently, "I don't have time to joke with you." Doflamingo stared. He took a deep breath for a while before he straightened his words and shouted, "If Lord Geoise allows me to join the Fegolando family, I am willing to swear allegiance to you to the death." "Well, you can go now." Doflamingo's mind has been completely turned upside down. What does it mean that he can leave? Where does Geoise want him to go? Are you going to report to the Fegolando family? He asked tentatively. What does Geoise mean? It means that you can leave Mariajoy now and go to the outside world to have a good time. Come to me when you have enough strength. The Fegolando family does not accept waste. I just gave you a chance. Why don't you want this opportunity? Geoise's words are like a veritable painting on blue star. Of course, the cake he painted is indeed very tempting. Doflamingo's face froze, and he wanted to say something more, but when he saw Geoise's increasingly impatient expression, he immediately responded. "Yes, I am really grateful to Master Geoise for giving me this opportunity. I will definitely try my best for this and never let you down." After saying that, Doflamingo turned around and strode towards the door. Geoise stopped him and said, "You must have put in a lot of effort when you came here. When you take the elevator down, you will see a ship. You go to the ship to find a man named Spangdine. Just say that I asked you to find him. He will get you where you want to go." Doflamingo immediately bowed deeply to Geoise with tears of gratitude, kept his posture and stepped back to the door step by step, finally turned around and opened the door to leave. After he left, Galen suddenly said, "Geoise, what on earth are you thinking? Don't tell me you were just teasing him." Geoise smiled and said, Uncle Jeline, this time you are not as discerning as me. That guy has good qualifications. If he can be used by the family, he will definitely be a good tool. On the way back, Galen asked, Geoise, how long are you going to stay in Mariajoy this time? Geoise thought for a while and said, if Uncle Jeline has nothing else to do, I might leave tomorrow. You kid, you just want to leave after taking something, right? Uncle Jeline, are you reluctant to let me go? Sulfuric acid. The sword at Garen's waist revealed a blade that was shining coldly. Geoise was not afraid at all. He put his hands behind his head and turned to Lucia and said, Lucia, you come with me then. A look of surprise appeared on Lucia's face. She had been feeling uneasy when she heard Geoise say he was leaving. Now she breathed a sigh of relief when she heard this. She nodded vigorously and said, as long as the young master is willing, Lucia will follow you wherever you go. Geoise smiled slightly, ignoring Jalen's gradually darkening face, and said, Uncle Galen, I have to ask the world government to fabricate a reasonable identity for Lucia. I want her to enter marine school. Jeline almost laughed angrily at Geoise, and he said angrily, are you practicing or enjoying yourself at marine school? Do you want me to help you make arrangements so that she can live in the same dormitory with you? That's no need. I don't live in a single dormitory. It would be inconvenient for Lucia to live with me. A big tic-tac-toe appeared on Galen's forehead. He turned away and said calmly, I don't care about this, you can figure it out yourself. No, Uncle Jeline, not many people in the world government know about me, so my words are not as effective as yours. Have you forgotten the one named Spangdine? I have promoted him to the commander of CP9. From now on, you can just give him direct orders for things like this. Haha, I see, it must be Uncle Jeline. I am very comfortable with this guy. Jeline stopped, squinted at Geoise, and said, don't be too happy too early. It's okay to go back, but you have to practice your sword skills here first. At least you have to learn how to go out first. Don't just use Muramasa to chop around. Geoise has no objection to this matter. No matter when, improving strength is the most important thing. However, in Geoise's opinion, the swordsmanship in One Piece is nothing more than ordinary slashing, with a powerful turn and flying. Back at home, it was getting late, so Jeline took Geoise directly to the restaurant to have dinner together. In the middle of the restaurant is a huge rectangular dining table with several gold candlesticks, which looks very gorgeous. Galen sat at the head of the dining table, picked up a newspaper prepared by the servant and read it. Geoise sat on his left side, while Lucia went out to order the servants to prepare meals. Looking at the empty restaurant, Geoise asked, Uncle Jeline, do you usually eat here alone? Galen looked down at the newspaper and said, well, you don't have to worry. Since I became the leader of the Knights of God, Gulindo has never had dinner with me again. He will not come over. Then where is he now? He must know that I am back. He stayed in the science class all day long, studying something else. Speaking of this, Galen sighed and continued, those are crooked ways after all. I haven't seen him go to the practice room in these years. Maybe he is practicing secretly behind your back, or he is focusing on improving the fruit's ability. When Gulindo was mentioned, the atmosphere instantly became solemn. Galen closed the newspaper, looked at Geoise and said seriously, Geoise, do you really want to kill him? He is your biological father after all. Geoise's eyes turned dark. He looked directly into Jalen's eyes and said firmly, I don't have a father like him, and he has never treated me as a son. To him, I am just a tool to improve my strength. Only one of us can survive in the end. Galen frowned and said, a tool to increase strength. What do you mean? It seems you don't know yet, Uncle Jeline. He spent so much effort experimenting on me. What do you think he wants to do? Don't you want you to defeat me in the future and take back the position of the head of the family for him? In fact, he thinks too much. I was planning to give the position of the head of the family to you, and I can only give it to you. Call. A dark tornado erupted from Geoise's back, and he said expressionlessly, Uncle Jeline, your thinking is too simple. He is just cultivating a perfect body for himself, and he will use special methods to seize the body in the future. He never wanted to rely on my son. In other words, from the beginning, he just wanted to kill me. What did you say? Galen stood up suddenly, endless anger pouring out of his eyes. He really didn't know about this matter. If he had known earlier, he would not have cared about the threat of Gulando and directly chose to clean up the door. Geoise's heart didn't look so calm either. He suppressed the emotions that were almost out of control. The darkness behind him slowly returned to his body and he continued. If I'm not wrong, what Gulando is currently researching should be about the method of exchanging bodies. After all, Op Fruit hasn't been born yet. He may be a little impatient. After listening to Geoise's words, Geline stood there silently and did not move for a long time. He did not doubt the truth of what Geoise said, because there was no need for Geoise to lie about such things. Geline had no choice but to kill his father with his own hands, which also caused a great psychological shadow on him, so just now he thought of persuading Geoise, telling Geoise not to follow his old path again, at least to stay. Guland got one more life. But now, he has completely given up this idea, because in his opinion, Gulando's behavior is simply worse than an animal, and he is not worthy of being a father at all. At this moment, Garin was completely disappointed with Gulando, his brother. He even wanted to go to Gulando right away and fix him severely. He will not think about killing Gulando, because now his thoughts are consistent with Geoise, that is, Gulando's life must be taken by Geoise himself. The uncle and nephew were standing and sitting, and the whole restaurant fell into silence until Lucia's voice came from the door. Young master, the food is ready, do you want them to come up now? Hearing Lucia's voice, Geoise finally calmed down. He took a deep breath, put on a relaxed face, and shouted to Lucia. Lucia, let them serve the food, thank you for your hard work. Lucia trotted over and took a strange look at Galen who was standing there with an ugly expression. Then she gently wrapped a white napkin around Geoise and said, Young master, this is what I should do. Please let me serve you for dinner later. Geline held his hands hidden in his sleeves tightly. He suddenly looked at Geoise and said apologetically, Geoise, I'm sorry. Lucia's eyes widened in surprise. What did she hear? Galen, who is called the king, actually apologized. What happened just now when she was away? Geoise trembled. He looked up at Geline with mixed emotions and whispered, Uncle Geline, you don't need to apologize. It was Gulando who concealed the truth. You didn't know it at the time. Galen shook his head and said, If I had been firmer then, you wouldn't have continued to be tortured there, and even almost died. Okay, Uncle Geline, you really don't have to think so much. You are my only relative. I have nothing to be sorry for. Let's eat. Speaking of which, this is our first time eating together. A smile appeared on Geoise's face, which made Geline feel increasingly uncomfortable. Just now was the second time in his life that he said the words, I'm sorry. The first time was when he personally put the sword into his father's heart. At that time, his father also had a happy smile on his face, and he, who was not good at expressing, just said sorry in the end. Galen sat back on the chair silently and murmured, A relative. Geoise turned her head and winked at Lucia. Lucia understood immediately. She snapped her fingers, and a group of servants holding dishes rushed in outside the door. Some people came out to put napkins around Galen. Galen was very depressed during the meal, but Geoise was deliberately trying to guide him, hoping to make him happy. Lucia was a little confused by this scene, because the identities of the uncle and nephew seemed to have been reversed, and Galen rather, he looked like a wrong child. The dinner ended in this weird atmosphere. After the meal, Galen went to his bedroom accompanied by several servants. Only Geoise and Lucia were left in the restaurant. Although Lucia was curious about Galen's strange behavior, she did not ask. After living in a family like Fegalandu for so many years, she knew what was right. Geoise rubbed his swollen temples, stood up and said, Lucia, let's go rest too. Lucia blushed. She hummed slightly, then helped Geoise take off the napkin and put it on the table, and went to the bedroom with Geoise. When he arrived in the bedroom, Geoise lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling above him in trance. In fact, he was not as relaxed as he had been in the restaurant. Everything he experienced in the laboratory as a child had already become his inner demon. If he hadn't faced Galen, he would never have mentioned it again. Suddenly, Geoise felt someone touching his feet. He stood up and saw that Lucia was taking off his shoes. He had been in a daze on the road just now, and he had ignored Lucia who had been following him. He said quickly, "Okay Lucia, you go and rest. I can do the undressing myself." With that said, Geoise was about to take his feet away from Lucia's arms but was hugged by Lucia. Lucia looked at Geoise and smiled softly, and said softly, "Young master, it is my duty to help you change clothes. You didn't say anything during the day. That's because I only changed into a coat and didn't take off my shoes. They were so dirty." "What are you talking about? Young master, just lie down and let me do the rest." Perhaps because she was afraid that Geoise would move randomly, Lucia moved her hands faster, took off Geoise's shoes, and then moved closer to Geoise, lowering her head to unbutton his shirt. Geoise quickly grabbed her hand and said, "Wait a minute Lucia, I'm going to bed." Lucia slowly raised her head, and Geoise saw that there were two purple flames burning in her eyes, which were the flames of desire. She actually used the fruit ability. Geoise was a little dumbfounded, wondering what kind of trouble this was going to cause. Under the influence of the flames of desire, Lucia's face once again showed the charming look she had during the day's battle, and her behavior became more and more bold. She pushed Geoise directly onto the bed, then she took her hand away from Geoise's hand, stretched out a finger to draw a circle on Geoise's chest, and said in an extremely charming voice, "Young master, you were right, it's time to sleep now." After saying that, Lucia burst out with astonishing speed, and with Geoise's confused eyes, she stripped him down to only a pair of underwear. Just when Lucia stretched out her hand towards Geoise's last line of defense, Geoise couldn't hold back any longer. The dark fruit ability was activated, his hand turned into pitch black, he grabbed Lucia's shoulder and shouted, "Lucia, wake up." Lucia's face froze, and the fire of desire in her eyes was extinguished instantly. She stared blankly at Geoise in front of her, her pretty face turned red at a speed visible to the naked eye, and she murmured, "Young master, I." Before she could finish speaking, her body went limp and collapsed on Geoise. Hiss. Geoise was shirtless now. Being touched by Lucia like this made him feel a little bit off guard. He took a deep breath, put his hand on Lucia's back and asked, "Lucia, what happened to you just now? Why did you even use the fruit power?" Lucia buried her face in Geoise's arms and said in a low voice, "I'm really sorry, young master. I just wanted to embolden myself, so I used a little bit of fruit power. I didn't expect the effect to be so strong." Hearing this reason, Geoise suddenly said in a dumbfounded way, "To be brave. Why are you so brave when you have nothing to do? Can I still eat you?" "Young master, if you want, I can. Over the years, I have learned a little bit about this from some female officers who are responsible for training slaves." Geoise glanced at Lucia's little head helplessly and said, You have been thinking about something all day long. We have just reunited for a day, and Uncle Geline just told me not to use my mind on this. If tonight I will, well, if I let him know, he is determined to make me look good tomorrow, and he will probably not let you go with me." Hearing the last sentence, Lucia suddenly stood up from Geoise and said in horror, "No, I finally waited for the young master to come back. I don't want to be separated from you again." After saying that, Lucia jumped out of bed, ran to the closet and magically took out a black silk pajamas from Geoise's black formal clothes. She put it on in front of Geoise, and then all of a sudden she got into Geoise's arms, closed her eyes tightly and said, "Good night, young master." Lucia lay in Geoise's arms and quickly fell asleep, while Geoise couldn't sleep at all for some reason. However, his body is already extraordinary. Even after a sleepless night, he is still energetic when he wakes up the next morning and does not feel tired at all. After changing clothes and having breakfast under Lucia's service, Geoise thought that Galen did not show up during breakfast. Geoise thought that what he said last night should have stimulated Galen a lot, and he might not have recovered yet. However, just after Geoise finished breakfast, Carlos came to the restaurant to deliver a message. "Lord Ji Geshung, the head of the family wants you to go to the practice room now." "I see." Geoise did not take Lucia with him and went to yesterday's practice room alone. In the practice room, Geline, dressed in black Taoist uniform, held a wooden sword and faced the door with his back. As soon as Geoise stepped in, he felt a sharp sword energy coming towards his face. The demon sword Muramasa seemed to sense the danger and appeared in Geoise's hands instantly. Before Geoise could say hello, Geoise turned around and slashed out with a sword energy. Geoise's pupils shrank and he subconsciously raised his knife to block. Sulfuric acid. Jalan's sword energy didn't even use his weaponry. To put it bluntly, it was just an ordinary slash, but it actually made Geoise retreat several meters in an instant. This was even when demon sword Muramasa absorbed most of the impact for him. Geoise's right hand holding the sword was still trembling slightly, and his face was solemn. This was the first time that he had personally felt Guon's terrifying strength. The title, King, was well deserved. Compared with Guon's sword energy, Guon's kind can't even be considered as tickling. There was no wave on Guon's face, just like when he faced off against rocks in the Valley of the Gods, he was the absolute king with the sword in his hand. The wooden knife in his hand was gradually wrapped in a red gas. Geoise frowned and thought, isn't that Conqueror's entanglement? Is Uncle Geoise serious about it? However, Geoise didn't give Geoise time to think at all. His figure gradually became illusory, and he appeared in front of Geoise in an instant. He raised the wooden knife in his hand and suddenly slashed at Geoise's shoulder. At this juncture, Geoise activated his sense of sight to ultimate, and used Kamui when the wooden sword was about to contact his body. The body hollow avoided Galen's attack. A look of surprise appeared on Jalan's face. Geoise seized the opportunity and instantly wrapped his arms around Muramasa, the demon sword. He held the sword in both hands and struck upward. It's a pity that Guon is not Kizaru. Even when facing the unknown Kamui, he was only distracted for a moment. With the blessing of the top level of knowledge and color, Geoise turned his wrist at the moment Geoise's body solidified, causing the wooden sword to hit Muramasa's blade diagonally, deflecting the attack trajectory. However, Geoise's attack did not end. He let go of his hands, and the demon sword Muramasa turned into darkness. Then it split into 7 black swords and hovered in the air, with the tips pointing directly at Guon. This move was a move that Geoise suddenly realized during the battle. He was automatically possessed by the named fruit and whispered, floating life with 10,000 blades, 7 killing swords. 7 black knives formed a circle and strangled Geoise. Geoise tapped his toes on the ground and retreated quickly. The 7 black knives were like gangrene attached to the bones. No matter where he appeared, they could never catch up with him. Seeing that he couldn't get rid of it, Geoise simply stopped, and with a wave of his hand, he knocked one of the knives away. However, the knocked away knife quickly returned to the sword formation, and the offensive did not slow down at all. Not only was Guon not a coward, but he had a look of approval on his face. He finally said, did Muramasa give the invisible darkness a physical form? It's a good idea, but the attack power is still not enough. After saying that, a terrifying aura erupted from Guon's body. The red gas wrapped around the wooden knife spread to his body along the blade. He raised the wooden knife and stabbed it into the air, shouting in a low voice, King's Sword Yuji. Buzz. A transparent knife-shaped shockwave spurted out from the tip of his sword, penetrating through the 7 black knives, stabbing him. The 7 black knives trembled slightly in midair, and then they all fell to the ground. Ultimately 1. The shock wave was so fast that it penetrated Geoise's body before he could react. He only felt that his mind was shaken, and his whole body seemed to be washed away. His body went limp and he knelt down on one knee. The demon sword Muramasa flew back, his hands to support his body. Geoise sheathed the knife gracefully and walked towards Geoise, saying as he walked, this is the swordsmanship of our Fegalando family, called the King's Sword. What do you think of its power? Geoise took a deep breath and said, it's very strong. What's going on with this invisible sword energy? Geoise walked up to Geoise, stretched out his hand to pull him up, and said, this is another application of Conqueror's. King's Sword is a sword technique that complements Conqueror's Haki. The Yuji just now is just the first move. It brings Conqueror's shock to the mind to the ultimate, focusing on the sword to explode. Even Logia's elementalization cannot be avoided. I have to say that this swordsmanship really illustrates the self-confidence of the Fegalando family. The basis for practicing it is Conqueror's. Judging from the prosperity of the Fegalando family, as long as there is a loser, this swordsmanship there is a risk of being lost. Geoise nodded slightly and said, but my conquerors has only just awakened, and at most it can be released. It's difficult to control it as freely as Uncle Geline. I'm afraid it's still a little difficult to master this swordsmanship. Galen chuckled a few times, crossed his arms and said, are you a little too eager to achieve success? But it doesn't matter. Practicing this swordsmanship will also improve your conquerors. As I said, the two complement each other. After hearing this, Geoise finally felt relieved. He didn't want to stay here for too long. Even with Geline by his side, the Grando hidden in the darkness still made him feel a little uneasy. He raised his head and asked, Uncle Geline, you just said that Yuji is only the first form of the King's Sword, so what are the other forms? The King's Sword has only 3 styles in total. The remaining 2 styles are Zhengguo and God Killing. The ancestors used this last style to kill Joey Boy back then. Uncle Geline must have mastered the last move, right? Yeah, but I can't unleash the true power of God Killer because it requires the power of Dark Fruit. Speaking of this, Galen's expression looked a little regretful. He patted Geoise's shoulder and said sincerely, Dark Fruit chose you in the end. I hope you can show your uncle the true power of this move one day. Whether the family can take a step further depends on you. Well, I won't let you down. Haha, okay, I'll show you the next 2 moves, and you'll have to figure it out on your own from now on. In the next month, except for going back to the palace to rest at night, Geoise basically spent time with Galen in the practice room. During this period, Geoise had informed Ginny at Marine School that she would stay in Mariajoy for a few more days to reassure her. What he didn't know was that the bear was already preparing to set off to find him that day. If he was there at night, the bear would probably fly directly to Mariajoy, and things would be a bit troublesome then. A month later, Geoise, whose hair had almost reached his shoulders, walked out of the practice room. In just 1 month, his temperament had undergone earth-shaking changes. There was a black aura faintly surrounding his body, giving people a mysterious and majestic feeling. Lucia, who had been waiting outside the practice room all day, immediately stepped forward and put a black cloak on Geoise and said softly, You're tired, young master. Let's go back and clean up quickly. Geoise smiled and was about to speak when Geline also walked out of the practice room. He put his hand on Geoise's shoulder and whispered, Geoise, I am very satisfied with your performance today. It seems that you no longer need me to teach you in the future. You can go back to Marine. Geoise was stunned for a moment. He had been focusing on practicing during this period and almost forgot that he had been here for a month. Looking at Jalen's slightly tired eyes, Geoise was deeply moved. During this period of time, Geline could be said to have devoted himself to teaching him, putting in even more energy than he did. Geoise held Jalen's hand on his shoulder and said, Thank you, Uncle Galen. A smile appeared on the corner of Galen's mouth. He waved his hand and said, Go back. There is no need to say thank you between you and me. Who made you my nephew? After saying that, he took out a newspaper from his arms and unfolded it. Geoise glanced at it suspiciously. It was almost all about the Roger pirates. After Rock's death, Roger's reputation at sea became more and more powerful, and his affairs would naturally be focused on by newspapers, such as which country he appeared in, or which pirate group he defeated. What was published in this newspaper was that Roger was causing a scene in a country, and there was a photo of Roger's pirate group at the top. From the photo, you can see soldiers rolling their eyes everywhere, and Roger is stepping on an officer covered in blood, grinning widely, and behind him are a group of members of the Roger pirates. Lucia also saw this photo, with a look of disgust on her face, and said hatefully, Pirates, they are just a bunch of scum. Geoise comforted the emotional Lucia for a while, then turned to look at the silent Galen and asked, Uncle Geline, what do you mean by showing me this? Do you want me to be careful about Roger? Geline silently pointed to the edge of the photo, where there was a child wearing a straw hat. Because the frame he occupied was too small, Geoise didn't notice him just now. But at this glance, he immediately recognized that the child wearing a straw hat was one of the future 4 emperors, the red-haired Shanks. At the same time, he also remembered the speculation about the red-haired life experience on Blue Star. He was probably Galen's son. And Jalen's next words also made Geoise more convinced of this guess. Now that you have become a Marine, you may encounter the Roger pirates one day. This pirate group is indeed very strong, so you should be careful when the time comes. After giving Geoise a few words, Garland paused, then looked at Shanks in the photo and said, "Also, if you meet this guy, leave him alive." Geoise didn't ask anything. He nodded very simply and said, "I understand, Uncle Geline, don't worry." Geline raised his head, took a deep look at Geoise, and said slowly, "Don't you want to know who he is? I don't need to know this. I just know that he must be a very important person to Uncle Geline." "Haha, maybe he is similar to me." Galen was stunned for a moment, then he nodded slightly and said, "Yes, you two are equally important to me. I don't want you to become enemies." "Then do I need to find a chance to bring him back?" "No, I once told you, choose your own path, and this sentence also applies to him." Speaking of this, Galen's tall body suddenly collapsed. He sighed heavily again, looked up at the gradually full moon in the sky, and whispered, "But his path has gone in the opposite direction from you and me." After saying that, Galen left alone, leaving only one sentence. "Tomorrow I will arrange a ship to take you back in the name of world government. Have a good rest tonight." Geoise didn't speak, but quietly watched Jalen's back gradually disappear into the night. The next day, Geoise and Lucia boarded Junrinen's boat. Geoise stood on the deck and looked up at the red line. He could feel a pair of sharp eyes watching him at the top. It wasn't until Red Line completely disappeared from sight that Geoise turned back to the cabin and chatted with Lucia about marine school, letting her know some information in advance so that she could adapt to life there faster. On the training ground of marine school, Akainu was having a fierce hand-to-hand battle with a bear. The two of them did not use any fruit abilities, but used a pair of fists covered in armed colors to fight passionately. Akainu's size seemed a bit petite in front of the bear, but judging from the confrontation between the two, the bear was obviously suppressed by Akainu. He retreated steadily under Akainu's ferocious offensive like a volcanic eruption. Kizaru was eating a banana on the side, and looked at him with great relish. Storoberry, who had a very high forehead, squatted next to him and said, "Porosalino, why don't you go up and spar with Sakazuki? I think the bear can't hold on any longer." Kizaru threw the banana peel into the air, and then another laser shot it into ashes. He stood up, stretched his butt, and said lazily, "I won't go. It's rare that the old man isn't here. Why not just relax? What's the point of fighting?" Staloberry was also used to Kizaru's style. He shrugged and said, "Speaking of which, I don't know what happened to Teacher Zephyr today. He hasn't come yet. Who knows? Come on, bear. I'm optimistic about you." At this time, in Zephyr's office, Zephyr was looking at a resume on the table seriously. The photo on the resume showed a young girl with a beautiful face, but her expression looked a little cold. Of course he was not attracted by the photo. What caught his eye was the information on his resume. Darkside Lucia, Zone's Phantom Beast species and Fallen Angel form. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.